Hey, tonight we're talking about a woman who was handed the worst starting position imaginable, orphaned at birth, shipped off to France at 14 like a political package nobody really wanted, laughed at by an entire royal court, and then she outlasted every single one of them. Drop a comment where are you watching from right now, and let's begin. Florence, 1519. The most powerful banking family in Europe just had a daughter, both parents dead within weeks. Nobody cried for long. After all, what could a girl possibly do with a name like Medici and no one left to protect her? Turns out, everything. The world she was born into had one rule: power belongs to men, by blood, by sword, by God's design. Catherine had none of that. What she had was something far more dangerous: time, and she was very, very patient. She arrived in France in 1533 with 14 years of life experience, a considerable dowry, and absolutely zero allies. The French court looked at Catherine de Medici the way old money always looks at new money, with a smile so thin you could slice bread with it. She was Italian in a court that considered Italy a charming place to visit, but not exactly a source of legitimate royalty. She was a Medici, which meant her family's fortune came from banking, a profession that medieval aristocracy ranked somewhere between tax collecting and being mildly unpleasant at dinner parties. And she was a girl, which in the diplomatic calculus of the 16th century meant she was essentially a very elaborate wedding gift that was expected to start producing heirs on a reasonable schedule. The marriage itself was arranged by Pope Clement VII, who happened to be Catherine's cousin, which was either very convenient or a sign of how small the relevant circles of power actually were. She was wed to Henry, the second son of King Francis I of France. Note, second son. This is important. Nobody particularly expected Henry to ever become king. He had an older brother, Francis, who was first in line and generally considered the one the whole succession plan revolved around. Catherine, therefore, was not marrying into the spotlight. She was marrying into the backup plan. The wedding took place in Marseille, which even by 16th century standards was considered a somewhat unglamorous venue for a royal occasion, but Pope Clement had insisted on a southern location for reasons of personal comfort. Apparently holiness did not come with cold weather tolerance. The French court received her with the kind of politeness that is, in many ways, worse than open hostility. Open hostility you can fight. Polite contempt just sits there, radiating disappointment. The noblewomen at court had perfected the art of saying nothing particularly offensive while communicating volumes. Her accent was noted. Her fashion sense Florentine naturally, and therefore slightly too creative for French tastes, was noted. Her manners, shaped by the Renaissance culture of Italy, were noted. Everything about her was noted, filed away, and used as quiet ammunition in the endless social warfare of palace life. The French aristocracy of this period operated like a very competitive homeowners association, obsessed with rules, deeply suspicious of outsiders, and absolutely certain that their particular way of doing things was the only correct one. What made it worse was that Catherine genuinely came from a remarkable world. Florence in the early 16th century was arguably the most intellectually alive city in Europe. The Medici family had spent generations funding artists, architects, philosophers, and scientists. They essentially bankrolled the Renaissance as a personal project. Catherine grew up surrounded by art that would later end up in the world's greatest museums, in a city where the conversation at dinner might casually involve the nature of the universe or the proper proportion of a human figure. She arrived in France carrying this entire cultural inheritance in her head, and the French court's response was essentially, "Interesting, but have you considered being French instead?" Henry, her new husband, was not cruel to her. He was something arguably harder to navigate indifferent. He was 17 at the time of their marriage, grieving the recent death of his older brother, who had died under circumstances that were, to put it diplomatically, suspicious, and deeply attached to a woman named Diane de Poitiers, who was 20 years his senior and apparently possessed of some quality that made Henry completely uninterested in looking elsewhere. We will get to Diane in considerable detail later, because she deserves her own chapter and then some. For now, the relevant fact is that Catherine's husband spent the majority of his emotional energy on another woman from the very beginning of their marriage, which is the kind of domestic arrangement that requires either extraordinary patience or an extraordinary capacity for denial. Catherine, it turned out, had both. The French court had a specific grievance beyond mere snobbery. and it was one Catherine could do absolutely nothing about: her blood. The Medici were bankers, spectacular, world historically successful bankers who had funded popes and kings and essentially invented modern finance, but bankers nonetheless. The French aristocracy had a deep structural allergy to the idea that commercial success could translate into genuine nobility. In their view, real power came from land, from ancient lineage, from ancestors who had done impressive things on horseback several centuries ago. The fact that the Medici had more actual money than most of the families sneering at them was beside the point. Actually, it might have made things worse. Nobody enjoys being looked down upon by someone they also owe money to. There is a French word, bourgeoise, that the court used about Catherine with a particular inflection that made it clear they did not mean it as a compliment. She was the merchant's daughter playing at royalty. She was the Italian import in a court that prided itself on being the cultural capital of Europe. And she was, perhaps most damningly in their eyes, trying. You could see her trying. She learned French quickly, impressively quickly actually, but an accent is a stubborn thing, and hers remained. She studied French customs and adapted her manner, but adaptation reads as performance to people who grew up doing things naturally. Every effort she made to fit in was simultaneously proof that she didn't. Then the years passed. And with them came a problem that transformed quiet social contempt into something considerably more serious. She did not get pregnant. 1 year into the marriage, no child. 2 years, nothing. 3 years, 4, 5. The whispers that had been confined to drawing rooms began to reach the ears of people who actually made decisions. In 16th century royal politics, a queen who did not produce an heir was not merely failing at her job, she was a diplomatic liability, a broken contract, a waste of a perfectly good alliance. The marriage had been arranged to produce children who would bind French and Florentine interests together. Without children, the whole arrangement was just a girl with an accent eating at the French king's table indefinitely. The demands for an annulment began quietly. They always begin quietly. A word here, a suggestion there, surely the king might consider, given the circumstances, that another arrangement might be more productive. King Francis I, to his considerable credit, resisted these suggestions with more loyalty than Catherine might have expected from a father-in-law who had never been particularly warm toward her. He reportedly told those pushing for annulment that the marriage had not yet been given sufficient time and that he had confidence the situation would resolve itself. This was either genuine faith or diplomatic stalling, but either way it bought Catherine time she desperately needed. What Catherine did during those years of waiting and watching is, in retrospect, one of the more quietly remarkable things about her. She did not fall apart. She did not become bitter in visible ways that might justify the court's contempt. She observed. She listened. She learned the architecture of French power, who actually influenced whom, which alliances were genuine and which were performances, where the real decisions got made and by whom. The French court was an extraordinarily complex social machine, and Catherine spent a decade essentially reverse engineering it, while everyone assumed she was decorating a corner and waiting to be sent home. She also, it should be noted, pursued every remedy available to her for the infertility problem. The 16th century's approach to reproductive medicine was, by modern standards, a fascinating combination of genuine herbal knowledge, educated guesswork, and ideas that were somewhere between optimistic and truly unhinged. Catherine reportedly tried various treatments recommended by physicians, some involving herbs, that actually had medicinal properties, others involving rituals that belonged more to folk tradition than anything a modern doctor would recognize. She consulted astrologers, because in an era when astrology was considered a serious intellectual discipline rather than a newspaper entertainment feature, this was entirely reasonable behavior. She tried everything available to her, with the systematic thoroughness of someone who understood that her entire future depended on the outcome. At year 10, something changed. Catherine became pregnant, and then again, and again. Over the following years, she would have 10 children, which suggests that whatever the problem had been in the early years, it eventually resolved itself with considerable enthusiasm. The court, which had spent a decade treating her fertility as a personal failing, adjusted its position with the smooth amnesia of people who had never said anything critical in the first place. But here is the thing about 10 years of quiet humiliation. It does not disappear when circumstances improve. It accumulates. It calcifies into something hard and useful. Every dismissive comment about her accent, every smirk about her background, every conversation that stopped when she walked into a room, Catherine had catalogued all of it. Not necessarily consciously, not necessarily with any specific plan for revenge, but the pattern of her character in these years was being set in a very particular way. She was learning that she could endure things that would break other people, and that endurance was itself a form of power. The French court had made a significant miscalculation in how they treated her. They had assumed she was temporary, a political arrangement that would either produce heirs and fade into the background, or fail to produce heirs and be sent away. They had not considered the third option, that she would watch, learn, survive, and eventually know their world better than most of them did. When you spend a decade being underestimated, you accumulate an extraordinary amount of information about the people doing the underestimating. Catherine, by the time her circumstances began to change, had essentially completed a graduate degree in French court politics that none of her tutors had intended to give her. There is something almost structurally unfair about how history has treated this period of her life. The humiliations Catherine endured, real, sustained, and at times genuinely cruel, are often mentioned briefly before the narrative rushes toward the more dramatic chapters of her story. But those years matter enormously because they explain the woman she became. You do not develop the capacity for patience, for strategic thinking, for reading rooms and people and situations with cold precision from a comfortable upbringing where everything goes according to plan. You develop it from a decade of being the person everyone assumed could be safely ignored. The French aristocracy of the 1530s and 1540s were not, as a group, bad people in any dramatic sense. They were simply people operating within a system that gave them permission to treat Catherine as less than she was, and they took that permission without much thought. This is, historically speaking, a very human thing to do. The tragedy for them is that they were doing it to someone who was paying very close attention. Henry became king in 1547, when his father Francis I died. Overnight, Catherine went from being the neglected wife of a secondary prince to being Queen of France, a transformation that changed her title considerably more than it changed her actual influence, at least immediately. Henry's court was, in many practical ways, still organised around Diane de Poitiers, who had evolved from royal mistress to something closer to an unofficial co-ruler. Catherine's apartments at court were famously positioned directly below Diane's, a piece of architectural symbolism so pointed that it's hard to believe it was accidental. She could reportedly hear the floors creak above her. Whether this detail is literally true or merely historically convenient, it captures the reality of her position with uncomfortable accuracy. And yet, Catherine did not make scenes. She did not issue ultimatums. She did not do any of the things that the romantic imagination of later centuries would suggest a wronged queen ought to do. She attended court functions with Diane present, and maintained the expression of someone who had somewhere more interesting to be, but was too polite to say so. She focused on her children, she now had them, finally, and they became the centre of her political planning in ways that would only become clear later. She built relationships, carefully and deliberately, with people who might be useful. She watched Henry govern, learning the mechanics of French royal administration from a position everyone assumed was merely ornamental. This is the part of the story that tends to get overshadowed by what came later, the wars, the tragedies, the Bartholomew's Day events that made her name synonymous with ruthlessness in the popular imagination. But before any of that, there was just a woman who had been told in 100 different ways that she did not belong, who had decided that belonging was perhaps not actually the point. The point was to survive long enough to matter. And Catherine, in the years between her arrival in France and the death of her husband in 1559, was doing exactly that: surviving, accumulating, preparing for a role that nobody, including possibly herself, could fully predict. The cold fury that powered her through those years was not the hot anger of someone who has been recently insulted. It was something more measured and more lasting, the particular determination of a person who has been underestimated for so long that proving everyone wrong has become less an emotional need and more a simple organizational principle. She had been the girl nobody expected to amount to anything. She had been the merchant's daughter playing at royalty, the Italian accent in a French court, the wife who couldn't produce heirs for a decade. She had sat through all of it, watched all of it, learned from all of it, and she was not by any stretch of the imagination finished. While the ladies of the French court were perfecting their embroidery and practicing the kind of lute playing that suggested refinement without actually requiring talent, Catherine was doing something considerably more interesting with her time. She was studying. Not the polite, decorative studying that was considered appropriate for women of her station. A little poetry here, some scripture there, enough philosophy to hold a conversation without embarrassing anyone. Catherine was pursuing the kind of knowledge that made 16th century society genuinely uncomfortable when it appeared in the hands of a woman. Astrology, alchemy, herbalism, and the emerging sciences that sat on the blurry border between what the Church called legitimate inquiry and what it preferred to call something else entirely. This was not a hobby. In the Renaissance world, the distinction between science and what we might loosely call the occult was not the clean line we imagine it to be today. Astrology was a serious academic discipline taught at universities. Alchemy was practiced by people who would later be recognized as genuine pioneers of chemistry. Herbalism contained within it a substantial body of actual medical knowledge, alongside a fair amount of optimistic folklore. The men who studied these things were called natural philosophers, and many of them were considered among the greatest minds of the age. When Catherine engaged with the same material, she was not dabbling in the exotic fringes of knowledge, she was participating in the mainstream intellectual culture of her time. The fact that this has been subsequently used to paint her as sinister says more about how history treats curious women than it does about Catherine herself. She came to this world through Florence. The Medici family's relationship with knowledge was, by the standards of any era, extraordinary. Lorenzo de Medici, Catherine's great-great-uncle, the one history calls Lorenzo the Magnificent, which is the kind of nickname that tends to stick, had turned Florence into the intellectual capital of Europe, partly through genuine curiosity, and partly through the very Medici understanding that funding smart people was an excellent long-term investment. The Platonic Academy he sponsored brought together philosophers, artists and scientists in a way that made the city feel like the 15th century's version of a very well-funded research institution, except with better architecture and considerably more dramatic personal lives. Catherine absorbed this world as a child. Knowledge, in the environment she grew up in, was not separate from power, it was one of its primary expressions. When she arrived in France, she did not leave this intellectual inheritance behind. She brought with her a network of Italian scholars, physicians, and depending on who you ask and how generously you're feeling toward the historical record, astrologers, whose expertise range from the genuinely useful to the enthusiastically speculative. Among the most famous figures in her orbit was Nostradamus, the French astrologer and physician, whose reputation has only grown more complicated over the centuries. Whether Catherine actually had a significant personal relationship with Nostradamus, or whether this connection has been somewhat embellished by later storytellers who found the association irresistible, is a question historians debate with the polite energy of people who suspect the truth is less dramatic than the legend. What is clear is that she consulted astrologers regularly and took their counsel seriously, which again was entirely standard behaviour for a 16th century monarch. Almost every major ruler of the period did the same thing. Catherine's interest in astrology is only remarkable because she was a woman, and women's intellectual pursuits have always been subject to a different standard of scrutiny than men's. Her herbalism is more straightforward and in many ways more genuinely impressive. Catherine maintained an extensive collection of medicinal plants and had a real working knowledge of their properties that went considerably beyond what most people of her social position would have bothered to acquire. This was partly practical. 16th century medicine was in a transitional state, moving slowly from medieval traditions toward something more empirical, and someone who actually understood herbs had access to treatments that were in some cases more effective than what the official physicians were offering. It was also, undeniably, an area where the line between medicine and something more ambiguous ran through terrain that Catherine seemed quite comfortable navigating. Here is where the story gets genuinely complicated, and where the difference between historical evidence and legend becomes important to track carefully. Catherine was accused during her lifetime, and even more aggressively after her death, of using poison as a political instrument. The accusations range from the plausible to the baroque: poisoned gloves, perfumed letters that carried fatal substances, carefully administered compounds that mimicked natural illness. She acquired the nickname Madame la Serpente from her enemies, which at least has a certain poetic quality, even if it was not intended as a compliment. The Italian stereotype of the skilled poisoner rooted in real Renaissance-era developments in toxicology, but heavily mythologized, attached itself to Catherine with particular enthusiasm because she was Italian, she was interested in chemistry, and she was a woman in power, which is a combination that tends to generate accusations of witchcraft, or worse, in any century you care to examine. The actual evidence for systematic poisoning is, to put it diplomatically, thin. Many of the deaths attributed to Catherine's alleged machinations had other explanations: illness, accident, the general fragility of human life in an era before antibiotics, when a minor infection could kill a king and a difficult childbirth could kill a queen. Some of the specific accusations against her read, when examined closely, more like political propaganda than credible reporting. This is not to say Catherine was a gentle soul who never contemplated doing harm to her enemies. She was operating in a world where the stakes were literally life and death, and she was not naive about the tools available. But there is an enormous distance between was aware that poison existed and knew something about how plants worked and systematically eliminated opponents through chemistry, and the historical record does not clearly support the latter. What her knowledge did give her, beyond any specific application, was something more valuable in the long run: authority. In a court where Catherine's standing was perpetually questioned, where her Medici blood was treated as liability and her Italian origins as a social defect, her intellectual capabilities were something nobody could dismiss. She could discuss astronomy with scholars who might otherwise have looked through her. She could engage with physicians on their own terms. She could participate in the broader intellectual world of the Renaissance not as a passive patron, but as someone who had opinions, knowledge, and the capacity to hold her own in conversation with people who were considered the smartest minds of the age. She also, and this is worth paying attention to, used her network of learned Italians as an intelligence operation. The scholars, physicians, and specialists she gathered around her were not merely intellectual companions. They moved through the world, corresponded with other learned people across Europe, and returned to Catherine with information about what was happening beyond the walls of the French court. In an era without newspapers, without formal intelligence services in any modern sense, knowledge of what was actually going on in the world was one of the rarest and most valuable commodities in existence. Catherine, through her intellectual network, had access to information flows that most of her contemporaries did not. This is perhaps the most practical application of her scholarly interests, not any specific piece of esoteric knowledge, but the habit of building networks of informed, capable people who were loyal to her. Her astrological interests deserve one more note, because they reveal something about the texture of her thinking that is easy to miss. Catherine did not consult astrologers purely for predictions about the future. She used astrological frameworks as a way of thinking about cycles, timing, and the relationship between events. Whether or not the stars actually had anything to say about human affairs, a debate that was considered entirely open in the 16th century, the discipline of astrology trained its practitioners to think in long arcs, to consider how present circumstances related to larger patterns, to resist the temptation of purely reactive thinking. For a woman whose entire strategic approach was built on patience and long-term positioning, this was not an irrelevant intellectual habit. She was, in a sense, using astrology as a planning tool regardless of whether its cosmological claims were accurate. The alchemy is perhaps the most interesting piece of this portrait, not because of anything specific Catherine did with it, but because of what it tells us about how she approached knowledge in general. Alchemy in the Renaissance was simultaneously a genuine precursor to modern chemistry, a spiritual practice, a philosophical system, and an elaborate metaphor for personal transformation. The alchemist's goal, turning base metals into gold, or finding the substance that could grant immortality, was never quite achieved, but the pursuit generated an enormous amount of real chemical knowledge along the way. Catherine's engagement with alchemical ideas fits her character precisely. She was interested in transformation, in the possibility that something apparently worthless could become something of extraordinary value through the right application of knowledge and patience. If that sounds like a description of her own life trajectory, it probably is not entirely coincidental. Chapter 4. Diane de Poitiers. The Invisible War. There are rivalries in history that operate through dramatic confrontations, battles, public accusations, scenes that make it into the history books precisely because they happened loudly and visibly. And then there are rivalries conducted entirely below the surface, through patience and positioning and the slow, methodical dismantling of an opponent's advantages. Catherine's relationship with Diane de Poitiers was emphatically the second kind, and it lasted for nearly 2 decades, which by the standards of any rivalry is a remarkably long run. Diane de Poitiers was, by any reasonable assessment, a formidable person. She was 20 years older than Henry, born in 1499, making her roughly the same age as his mother, and had been his companion since he was a teenager, recovering from the trauma of being held as a hostage in Spain for several years, a situation that had apparently left him with attachment patterns that a modern therapist would find very interesting indeed. Diane was not merely Henry's mistress in the sense of a temporary romantic diversion. She was his confidant, his advisor, his emotional anchor, and in the view of many at court, the person who actually understood how to manage him. Henry was not, historians generally agree, a natural administrator or particularly gifted political strategist. He relied heavily on the people around him, and Diane was, for most of his adult life, the person around him most consistently. This created a situation for Catherine that was extraordinary in its particular combination of humiliation and political danger. Personally, she was living in a marriage where her husband's emotional world was organised almost entirely around another woman, a woman who was, additionally, older, more confident, more established at court, and apparently entirely unbothered by Catherine's existence, which is a particular kind of social dismissal that cuts deeper than open hostility. Politically, it meant that access to the king, the fundamental currency of power in an absolute monarchy, ran through Diane. Petitioners, nobles, foreign ambassadors seeking influence with the French crown had to navigate Diane's favour to reliably reach Henry's attention. Catherine, his actual wife, was in the peculiar position of having less practical access to her own husband than a woman who technically held no official position at all. Diane managed the household budgets for royal estates, including estates that should, by any conventional accounting, have been under Catherine's authority. She received gifts from Henry that were properly speaking crown property: jewels, lands, the Château d'Annay, which Henry had built for her as an architectural love letter of considerable ambition and expense. She wore the royal colours. Henry combined their initials in decorative monograms throughout his palaces, which Catherine had to walk past every day, an interior design choice that was either thoughtless or deliberately pointed, and in either case not exactly conducive to domestic harmony. The French court watched all of this and drew its own conclusions about where power actually resided, which naturally shaped how people positioned themselves in relation to both women. What is extraordinary about Catherine's conduct during these years is not merely that she endured the situation plenty of queens endured difficult marriages because they had no practical choice. What is extraordinary is the quality of her endurance. She maintained, with remarkable consistency, the public behaviour of a dignified queen who was above reacting to petty provocations. She was gracious at functions where Diane was present. She gave no one the satisfaction of visible distress. She did not, as far as the historical record shows, attempt to have Diane removed through the kind of court intrigue that was readily available to someone in her position, and that several of her contemporaries would have employed without a second thought. She just watched, and she continued to watch for nearly 2 decades, which requires a degree of patience that is either genuinely admirable or slightly terrifying, depending on your perspective. In private, Catherine was almost certainly less serene than her public face suggested. There are accounts reliable in proportion to the usual uncertainty of 16th century court gossip of her having small peepholes drilled into the floor of her apartments so she could observe the rooms below, where Diane and Henry spent time together. Whether this is literally true or a story that attached itself to her because it fit the narrative people wanted to tell about her, it captures something real about her situation. She was a woman who survived by knowing things other people didn't realize she knew, and who had learned that observation was a more reliable tool than confrontation. What she was building during these years, beneath the surface of gracious endurance, was a political network of her own. While Diane managed Henry's emotional landscape and the day-to-day administration of the court, Catherine was cultivating relationships with people who were not yet powerful, but might become so younger nobles, minor officials, intellectuals, the kind of people who tend to be overlooked by those focused on the current centre of power. She was also, through her children, creating the next generation of political connections. Her eldest son Francis, born in 1544, was the Dauphin, the heir to the French throne. Catherine's relationship with her children was intense and deliberate, in a way that sometimes disturbed contemporaries and that historians have read in various ways. As genuine maternal love, as political calculation, or most likely as both simultaneously, since the two are not mutually exclusive even if it is somewhat disconcerting when they operate together this openly. Henry's death in 1559 is one of those moments in history that demonstrates the universe's occasional taste for dramatic irony. He died in a jousting tournament, a celebratory event, meant to mark a period of peace when a lance splintered and a fragment pierced his visor and entered his eye. He lingered for 10 days and then died at 40 years old, leaving behind a kingdom, 3 sons, a widow who had been waiting patiently for approximately 26 years, and a mistress who had just run out of protection. Catherine's response to Henry's death has been described by contemporaries and historians alike, with a mixture of fascination and slight unease, because it did not look like uncomplicated grief. She wore black for the rest of her life, which was the conventional mourning behaviour for a widowed queen, so that part was standard. But within hours of Henry's death, her behaviour shifted in ways that suggested she had been mentally prepared for this moment for quite some time. She sent word to Diane de Poitiers that the crown jewels, the ones Henry had given Diane, the ones that belonged by rights to the Queen of France, were to be returned. Immediately. Diane, who had not survived 2 decades at the French court by being slow to read political shifts, complied. The jewels were returned. Diane retired to her chateau and lived out the remaining decade of her life in considerable comfort but political irrelevance, which under the circumstances was probably the best outcome she could have hoped for. There is a temptation to read Catherine's reclamation of the jewels as a moment of revenge, the widow finally able to collect what had been taken from her. And perhaps it was, in part. But it was also something more practical than that. Those jewels were not merely valuable objects, they were symbols of royal authority, physical representations of the crown's resources and dignity. Allowing Diane to keep them would have sent a message about where power resided in the new order that Catherine could not afford to send. The speed with which she acted hours after her husband's death, while the court was still processing the shock, tells you something important about her. She had not spent 26 years watching and waiting to then hesitate at the moment when action actually mattered. The invisible war was over, and the woman who had conducted it entirely in silence, without a single public confrontation, without any move that could be called ungracious or undignified, had won not by defeating Diane de Poitiers in any direct sense, but by outlasting the circumstances that had given Diane her power. Henry was gone. The protection that had elevated a mistress above a queen was gone with him. And Catherine, who had always been the queen regardless of how the court had treated her, was now something considerably more interesting. The mother of the King of France, the most powerful woman in the country, and entirely finished with waiting. 10 children in 13 years. Let that settle for a moment. Catherine de Medici, the woman who had spent the first decade of her marriage being treated as a diplomatic failure for not producing heirs, then proceeded to have 10 of them between 1543 and 1556. The French court, which had spent years openly discussing whether she should be sent back to Italy like a defective piece of imported furniture, suddenly found itself with considerably less to say on the subject. Reproduction, it turned out, was an area where Catherine was not going to underperform. But here is the thing about having 10 children when you are Catherine de Medici. You do not simply have them and hand them to nurses and get on with your life, the way that many royal mothers of the period essentially did. Catherine's relationship with her children was something different, more intense, more deliberate, more architecturally planned. She was not just producing heirs, she was building a dynasty, one child at a time, and she approached the project with the same systematic intelligence she brought to everything else. Each child represented a set of possibilities. Each one was, from very early in their lives, being shaped and positioned for a specific role. This sounds cold when stated plainly, and it probably was cold, at least in part. It was also the only logical response to the world Catherine was navigating. The eldest surviving son, Francis, became King Francis II in 1559, when Henry died and was 15 years old at the time of his accession. 15 is, by any measure, not an age at which a person is ready to run a major European kingdom, especially not one that was already showing signs of the religious tensions that would define the next several decades of French history. Francis was also, unfortunately, not in excellent health. He was a slight, quiet boy who had grown up somewhat overshadowed by the turbulence around him, and who was already married to Mary Queen of Scots, a detail we will return to shortly, by the time he became king. Catherine became his regent in all but formal title. She did not have the official designation immediately, because the court was still processing the transition, and because powerful factions saw an opportunity in the new king's youth to expand their own influence. But in practical terms, Catherine was running France, and anyone who understood how the French court operated knew it. Francis died in 1560, after less than 2 years as king, from an ear infection that spread in ways that 16th century medicine had no tools to address. He was 16. This was genuinely tragic, and Catherine's grief over losing her eldest son was real, whatever else she was. She was a mother who experienced the deaths of her children as losses, not merely as political setbacks. But she had not built her entire strategic position on the survival of a single child, and within a very short time she was organising the regency for her second son, Charles, who was 10 years old. 10, as a governing age, is even more theoretically challenging than 15. On the other hand, from Catherine's perspective, a 10-year-old king required a great deal of guidance, and she was very well positioned to provide it. Charles IX is one of the more melancholy figures in this story, which is saying something given the general competition for that title. He grew up under a form of maternal management that was, depending on how you read the evidence, either extraordinarily attentive or genuinely suffocating. Catherine kept him close in a way that went beyond ordinary maternal concern. She was present at his councils, she shaped his advisers, she managed his correspondence, she controlled to a remarkable degree the information environment around him, what he knew about the state of the kingdom, who he spoke to, what interpretations he received of the events around him. A modern person reading the accounts of their relationship would probably use words like enmeshed and boundary issues. A 16th century observer would have called it wise management of a young king. Both descriptions contain truth. What Catherine understood, and what gave her method its internal logic, was that her power was entirely derivative. She had no independent claim to authority. She was not the ruler, she was the mother of the ruler, and then the mother of the next ruler, and then the mother of the ruler after that. Her ability to act, to govern, to implement any of the decisions she believed necessary for France's stability, depended entirely on maintaining proximity to whoever wore the crown. The moment one of her sons became genuinely independent, capable of making decisions without her input, comfortable with advisers who were loyal to him rather than to her, able to imagine governing without her presence, her position became precarious. So she kept them dependent, not out of pure cynicism, but out of a structural reality. In a world that gave her no formal authority, proximity to power was the only authority available. This is where the question of love versus calculation becomes genuinely interesting, and also genuinely unanswerable. Catherine's letters to her children, and she wrote to them constantly, with a frequency and emotional intensity that is striking even accounting for 16th century letter-writing conventions, are full of what reads as genuine maternal warmth. She worried about their health, their happiness, their relationships. She missed them when they were separated. She wrote to Charles with a tenderness that coexists, sometimes in the same paragraph, with pointed advice about who he should trust and what decisions he should make. The love and the management are so thoroughly interwoven in her correspondence that it is impossible to separate them, which probably reflects the reality of how she experienced them. She may not have experienced them as separate things at all. Her daughters were a different kind of project, and in some ways a more straightforwardly political one, though not less carefully considered. Royal daughters in the 16th century were diplomacy in human form. You married them to allies, potential allies, or former enemies you were trying to convert into allies, and in doing so you created bonds of kinship that were supposed not always successfully, but supposed to translate into political stability. Catherine had 4 daughters who survived childhood, and she deployed them with the strategic precision of someone who had spent decades watching how alliances were built and broken. Elizabeth of Valois was married to Philip II of Spain in 1559, the same year Henry died, the same year that everything in Catherine's world changed simultaneously. Philip II of Spain was at that point probably the most powerful monarch in Europe, and securing a connection between the French crown and the Spanish one was a significant diplomatic achievement. Elizabeth was 13 years old, Philip was 32. This was, by 16th century standards, an entirely unremarkable age gap for a royal marriage, which tells you something useful about what life expectancy calculations did to people's sense of appropriate timelines. Elizabeth became Queen of Spain, and by all accounts a genuinely effective one, she was popular at the Spanish court, maintained a warm correspondence with her mother that is one of the more touching document collections of the period, and died in 1568 at 23 while delivering a stillborn child. Catherine's grief at her death was, by contemporary accounts, profound. Claude of Valois, the second daughter, was married to Charles III, Duke of Lorraine, a slightly less spectacular match geographically, but an important one for managing the complex northeastern border dynamics that were a perpetual headache for French foreign policy. Margaret of Valois, Marguerite, known to history and to romantic legend as Queen Margot, was the most complicated of Catherine's daughters, the one who most consistently refused to behave according to the script her mother had written for her, and who would eventually become the subject of Alexandre Dumas' dramatic and not entirely historically reliable novelization, which is the kind of literary immortality that tends to obscure as much as it reveals. We will meet Marguerite again in a later chapter, because her story intersects with some of the most significant and difficult events of Catherine's later years. The third son, Henry, who would become Henry III, was Catherine's favourite, a fact that was apparently not particularly well hidden from his brothers, which created the kind of sibling dynamic that family therapists would find rich material for discussion. Henry was elegant, intelligent, and possessed of a temperament that was considerably more refined than his brothers, which his mother found appealing and the French aristocracy found alternately admirable and confusing. He was also, from Catherine's perspective, the son most capable of the kind of political sophistication she valued the ability to manage people, to read situations, to operate with patience and indirection rather than brute force. She invested heavily in his development and his positioning, which paid off when he eventually became king, but created considerable tension with Charles IX in the meantime. The relationship between Catherine and Charles IX deteriorated progressively as Charles grew older and began to resent with increasing clarity the degree to which his mother's management of him had limited his actual development as an independent ruler. There is something genuinely tragic about Charles IX, a young man who was placed on a throne at 10, given responsibilities he was not prepared for, surrounded by adults with competing agendas, and managed by a mother who loved him fiercely, but whose love expressed itself in ways that made genuine autonomy very difficult. He drank heavily. His health deteriorated. He died at 23, the same age as his sister Elizabeth, which, given everything he had lived through, is perhaps less surprising than it might otherwise seem. His last coherent conversations, according to contemporary sources, involved questions about what had been done in his name and whether it had been right, a reference to events we will discuss in a later chapter that cast a long shadow over the final years of his reign. What the children, taken together, represent in Catherine's story is something more than a political strategy, even if political strategy was woven through every decision she made about them. They were her justification, her legitimacy, and her occupation for 3.5 decades. She was the mother of kings of France. That was her title, her role, the source of whatever authority she possessed, and the framework through which she interpreted her own life. When historians debate whether she was primarily a mother or primarily a politician, they are asking a question that probably made no sense to Catherine herself. The two roles were, for her, completely identical. Being a good mother meant ensuring her children's survival and power. Ensuring their survival and power required being an excellent politician. There was no version of the story in which these things were separable. This also means that the losses hit twice. When Francis died at 16, Catherine lost a son and a political position simultaneously. When Charles died at 23, she lost another son and had to navigate another transition. When her daughters died, young Elizabeth at 23, Claude at 27, she lost children she had loved and deployed and grieved in the complex layered way that only makes sense when love and strategy have been intertwined from the beginning. The emotional arithmetic of her life was almost impossibly complicated. Every child represented both a person she loved and an investment she had made, and the losses could not be cleanly separated into the personal and the political, because she had never allowed them to exist separately in the first place. There is one more dimension to Catherine's approach to motherhood that tends to get overlooked in the broader discussion of her political methods, and it is perhaps the most revealing. She was extraordinarily well informed about her children, not just generally attentive in the way that wealthy parents could afford to be through a network of servants and tutors, but specifically granularly, sometimes unsettlingly well informed. She knew who they were spending time with, what they were saying in private, how they were feeling about political developments, which advisors were gaining influence with them. She maintained, around each of her children, a network of people who kept her informed ladies-in-waiting, household servants, court officials that amounted to a domestic intelligence service. This was not paranoia exactly. It was the logical extension of the observation habit she had developed during her years of powerlessness at the French court. If information is the basis of power, and your power depends on your children, then you need information about your children. The chain of reasoning is internally consistent even if the result is somewhat uncomfortable to contemplate. It is worth noting, in fairness to Catherine, that several of her children managed to live lives of considerable substance and achievement, despite or perhaps in some cases because of the intensity of her management. Henry III, whatever his later difficulties, was a genuinely capable ruler in some respects, and possessed a cultural sophistication that made the French court under his reign a significant intellectual centre. Marguerite of Valois survived her tumultuous life to write memoirs that are among the more readable first-person accounts of the period. Even Charles IX, in his better moments, showed flashes of genuine political intelligence that suggested he might have been more effective under different circumstances. Catherine's children were not merely her instruments. They were also complicated and flawed and struggling, real people shaped by an extraordinary mother who loved them in the only way she knew how completely, strategically, and without any apparent recognition that these two things might eventually conflict. The question of whether it was love or calculation that drove Catherine's approach to her children is ultimately the wrong question. The right question is, what does it mean to love someone when you have been taught, by a lifetime of experience, that love without strategy is just vulnerability? Catherine had learned, in the hardest possible way, that sentiment unprotected by planning is not warmth, it is exposure. She had watched her own helplessness during the years when she had no children and no influence, and no position that was safe from challenge. She was not going to let her children be helpless in the same way. If that required her to shape them more deliberately than most mothers do, to keep them closer than was perhaps entirely healthy, to build her own authority into the architecture of their development well. She had been told all her life that she was not suited for the world she lived in. She had decided quietly and comprehensively that the world was going to have to adjust. If Catherine de Medici had been asked at any point during the 1550s to identify the single most dangerous person in the French court, she would not have named a general, a cardinal, or a foreign ambassador. She would have named a teenage girl with extraordinary cheekbones and a claim to 3 crowns simultaneously. Mary Stuart, known to history as Mary, Queen of Scots, known to the French court as their beloved Dauphine, known to Catherine as a problem that required very careful handling, arrived in France at age 5 and proceeded to become, entirely without apparent effort, the most talked about person in any room she entered. This is the kind of quality that is charming in a dinner guest and deeply inconvenient in a daughter-in-law. Mary had been sent to France in 1548 by her mother, Mary of Guise. Partly for her safety, Scotland was in a complicated political situation, which was essentially Scotland's default state, and partly because a marriage alliance with the French crown was worth pursuing seriously. She was raised at the French court, educated alongside the royal children, and became, by all contemporary accounts, a genuinely exceptional young woman. She spoke French, Latin, Greek, Spanish, and Italian, which was the 16th century equivalent of having multiple advanced degrees, except that she apparently managed it without seeming insufferably smug about it. She was tall, graceful, possessed of the kind of natural confidence that comes from being universally admired from early childhood, and she genuinely charmed people effortlessly, including, crucially, Catherine's eldest son Francis, who was betrothed to her, and who seemed, in his quiet way, to be genuinely devoted to her. Catherine watched all of this with the expression of someone who has spotted a problem but is not yet sure of its exact dimensions. Mary herself was not the issue, or rather, Mary herself was only part of the issue. The larger problem was standing directly behind her, wearing cardinal's robes and an expression of confident ambition, the House of Guise. The Guises were one of the most powerful noble families in France, and they were not the kind of family that was content to be merely powerful. They wanted to be indispensable. The family's senior figures in this period were Francis, Duke of Guise, a celebrated military commander with the kind of battlefield reputation that made him enormously popular with the French nobility, and his brother Charles Cardinal of Lorraine, who was one of the most politically sophisticated operators in the French church, and who had a talent for making his ambitions sound like perfectly reasonable positions that any sensible person would hold. Mary of Scots was their niece. Her mother was a Guise, and the Guises had identified with considerable clarity that a niece who was Queen of France, which Mary would become if and when Francis became king, was potentially the most useful political asset in Europe. Their plan was not complicated to understand, though it was ambitious to execute. If Mary was Queen of France, and if the Guises were Mary's family, then the Guises were the family of the Queen of France, and in a court where access to the monarch was the fundamental unit of political currency, being the Queen's closest relatives was an extraordinarily strong position. They could manage Francis through Mary. They could manage Mary through family loyalty and the sheer force of Cardinal Charles's personality, which was the kind of personality that made people feel that disagreeing with him was not merely impolite but somehow structurally unsound. France, in this vision of the future, would be effectively governed by a family that happened to have placed a niece on the right throne at the right moment. Catherine understood this plan long before most people at court had fully articulated it to themselves. This was one of the consistent features of her political intelligence. She tended to see the structure of a situation before others had stopped being distracted by its surface details. The surface detail here was Mary beautiful, charming, genuinely lovely in all the ways that made court life pleasant. The structural reality was that Mary was a vehicle for Guy's power, and Guy's power, if it reached its logical conclusion, would leave Catherine with even less influence over her own son than she had managed to accumulate through 20 years of careful positioning. So Catherine did what she always did when confronted with a threat she could not address directly. She watched, she planned, and she began the slow, patient work of limiting the Guises' reach without ever appearing to oppose them openly. This was genuinely difficult, because the Guises were popular, competent, and well-connected, and because opposing them directly would have required a kind of open confrontation that Catherine had learned, during her years under Henry's reign, was almost never the most effective approach. You do not win against a family like the Guises by declaring war on them. You win by ensuring that the conditions that made them powerful gradually stop applying. Her first line of operation was informational. Catherine maintained, as we have discussed, an extensive network of people who kept her informed about what was happening throughout the court. She applied this network specifically to tracking the Guises' activities, their alliances, their conversations, the favours they were distributing and receiving, the officials they were cultivating. Cardinal Charles was particularly worth monitoring, because he operated with the smooth confidence of someone who assumed he was always the smartest person in the room, which meant he occasionally underestimated how much of his thinking was visible to people paying close attention. Catherine was paying very close attention. Her second line of operation was relational. She worked, quietly and without fanfare, to cultivate connections with nobles and officials who had their own reasons to be wary of Guy's dominance families who felt that the Guises were accumulating too much influence too quickly. Factions who resented being outmaneuvered by a family whose power was, after all, derived partly from the accident of having a niece in the right place. French court politics in this period was an ecosystem of competing interests, and Catherine was skilled at identifying the points where her own interests aligned with others. She did not need people to be loyal to her specifically. She needed them to be loyal to a vision of French court politics in which no single family held overwhelming influence, a vision that happened to coincide neatly with her own survival. The third line was perhaps the most delicate, managing Mary directly. Catherine's relationship with her daughter-in-law was predictably complicated. On the surface, it was perfectly correct. Catherine was gracious, Mary was respectful. They maintained the appearances of family harmony with the polished ease of two people who were very good at maintaining appearances. Beneath the surface, there was a persistent current of mutual wariness. Mary was intelligent enough to understand that her mother-in-law was not entirely delighted by Guy's influence, and Catherine was perceptive enough to know that Mary, whatever her personal qualities, was embedded in a family network that operated according to its own interests. The warmth between them was real in moments and entirely performative in others, and both women probably knew which was which more often than either admitted. What made Mary genuinely difficult to counter was that she was not doing anything wrong. She was a young woman who loved her family, who was loyal to her uncles, who conducted herself with the grace and intelligence that her upbringing had produced. The threat she represented was structural, not personal. You could not accuse her of scheming because she was not, in any obvious sense, scheming. She was simply existing in a position that gave her uncles leverage, and her uncles were doing the scheming on everyone's behalf. This is a politically frustrating situation, and Catherine navigated it with the resigned practicality of someone who understood that you cannot always choose your problems. Francis became King Francis II in July 1559, following Henry's death at the jousting tournament. He was 15 years old, in fragile health, deeply attached to Mary, and surrounded by the Guise family, who moved into positions of practical authority with a speed that suggested they had been mentally rehearsing for this moment for some time. Francis, Duke of Guise, took control of military affairs. Cardinal Charles took control of financial and diplomatic matters. The new king, young and unwell and emotionally dependent on his wife, was not in a strong position to resist this consolidation, and it is not clear that he wanted to. Mary's family was his family now, and he seems to have found the Guise brothers' confident competence reassuring rather than alarming. Catherine found it alarming on his behalf. She was not, at this point, formally excluded from power. She was the Queen Mother, she had a ceremonial role, she was consulted on matters where her input was considered appropriate. But the practical governance of France had shifted, and the shift was toward the Guises. Her access to Francis was filtered. Her advice competed with Cardinal Charles's advice, and Cardinal Charles had the advantage of being physically present and psychologically forceful in ways that Catherine, working through the more indirect channels available to her, could not easily match. This was, in a peculiar way, a mirror of what she had endured during Henry's reign, another period in which someone else held the king's attention and used that position to limit her influence. The difference was that this time Catherine had considerably more political experience, a clearer understanding of what she was dealing with, and a more developed set of tools for responding. She was not the naive 14-year-old who had arrived in France with no allies and no understanding of the terrain. She was a 50-year-old woman who had spent decades learning exactly how French court politics worked and where its pressure points were. She found allies in unexpected places. The Bourbon family, another major noble house, one with significant reasons of their own to be concerned about Guy's dominance, became a natural point of alignment. The Prince of Condé, Louis of Bourbon, was an increasingly prominent figure among the Protestant nobility, which created a complicated dynamic. Catherine was Catholic, the Bourbons were associated with the Protestant cause, and yet their mutual interest in limiting the Guises created a basis for cooperation that transcended religious alignment. This was one of Catherine's characteristic moves. She was consistently more interested in political outcomes than in ideological purity, which made her flexible in ways that more committed partisans found either admirable or deeply suspicious, depending on their perspective. She also worked to preserve whatever direct relationship she could maintain with Francis himself. A mother's access to a son is not easily blocked entirely, even when powerful people are working to limit it, and Catherine used her moments of access carefully not to make dramatic arguments against the Guises, which would have put Francis in an uncomfortable position and potentially pushed him toward them, but to simply maintain the relationship, to be present, to ensure that she remained a recognizable and trusted figure in his world. She was playing a long game, as she always played a long game, and the long game required staying in the picture even when the picture was not currently organised in her favour. Then, in December 1560, Francis died. He was 16 years old. The ear infection that killed him had been developing for months, and the court's physicians had not been able to do anything particularly useful about it, which was unfortunately typical of 16th century medicine's relationship with infections of any kind. His death was not a surprise to the people who had been watching his health closely, but it transformed the political landscape of France with a completeness that even Catherine, who had been anticipating the possibility, may have found startling in its totality. Mary was suddenly not the Queen of France. She was a young widow with a claim to the Scottish throne, and a theoretical claim to the English one. She considered herself the legitimate heir to England through her grandmother Margaret Tudor, which was a position that Queen Elizabeth of England found, understandably, somewhat concerning. But she was no longer Queen of France, which was the position that had given the Guises their leverage at the French court. Without a French king who was devoted to their niece, the Guises were still powerful, still well connected, still formidable. But they were no longer in the position of being the family of the Queen. The specific lever they had been using had just been removed. Mary stayed in France for several months, in mourning and in the process of figuring out what came next. She and Catherine were, during this period, genuinely kind to each other, in a way that the preceding years had not always managed two women who had both lost someone they cared about, navigating grief in the particular way of people who are accustomed to doing difficult things with public composure. Whether they were ever truly close is debatable. Whether they respected each other is somewhat more clear. Mary eventually departed for Scotland in August 1561, which was not a journey she made with particular enthusiasm. France had been her home for 13 years, and Scotland was a country she barely knew, governed by Protestant nobles who viewed her Catholicism with suspicion, and dramatically colder than the Loire Valley in most measurable respects. Her departure left France considerably quieter, politically speaking. The Guises remained a significant force. They did not disappear simply because their most useful card had left, but the specific threat of Guy's dominance through a Guy's queen was gone. The new king was Charles IX, 10 years old, and Catherine was his regent. The political geometry of France had shifted in a direction that was, from Catherine's perspective, considerably more workable. It would be too simple to say that Catherine had managed the Mary Stuart problem successfully. She had not destroyed the Guises. They remained powerful, well-organised, and deeply committed to their own advancement, and they would continue to be a significant factor in French politics for decades. What she had done was survive the period of maximum Guise leverage without losing her position entirely, while maintaining enough relationships and enough proximity to power that when circumstances changed, she was ready to move into the space that opened up. This was not a spectacular victory. It was something more characteristically Catherine, a patient, methodical non-defeat that positioned her for the next phase. The Guises, to their credit, understood what had happened. Cardinal Charles in particular was perceptive enough to recognise that the woman he had spent 18 months effectively marginalising had not been eliminated. She had been waiting. The competition between the Guise faction and Catherine's interests would continue through the religious wars of the following decades, taking on new forms as the political landscape shifted. But the specific chapter that had begun with Mary's arrival at the French court and the Guises' bid for dominance through her had ended, and it had ended with Catherine still standing. Mary herself went on to one of the more dramatically turbulent careers in European history, a second marriage to a Scottish lord, a third marriage to the man suspected of murdering the second, forced abdication, imprisonment, a lengthy captivity in England, and eventual execution ordered by Elizabeth I in 1587. Her story after leaving France is so eventful that it tends to overshadow the French chapter entirely, which is a pity because the French chapter is where you can see most clearly the dynamic between her and Catherine, two women of considerable intelligence, operating in the same space with incompatible interests, who managed to maintain the forms of civility while pursuing entirely different objectives. It is, in its way, one of the more sophisticated relationships in the historical record, and it deserves more careful attention than the romantic narratives about Mary usually give it. Catherine did not gloat about Mary's subsequent misfortunes. There is no record of her expressing satisfaction at the Scottish Queen's difficulties, and given Catherine's general approach to emotion in the political sphere, keep it private, keep it contained, never let it show in ways that can be used against you, this is probably accurate rather than merely a gap in the evidence. She had not wished Mary ill as a person. She had simply needed Mary's political position to stop being what it was, and events had obliged. That was sufficient. Catherine was not the kind of person who needed to see her opponents suffer. She needed them to stop being in her way, and in that very specific sense the situation with Mary had resolved itself more completely than she might have dared to plan for. What this chapter of her life demonstrates, more clearly than almost anything else in the record, is the particular quality of Catherine's strategic intelligence. She did not defeat the Guises by being smarter than they were, Cardinal Charles was genuinely brilliant, and Francis, Duke of Guise, was one of the most capable military commanders of the age. She did not defeat them by having more resources or more formal authority. She defeated them, to the extent that she did, by understanding that political situations are not static, that the conditions which create someone's power are temporary, that patience is itself a form of strategy, and that the person who is still standing when circumstances shift has often won something more durable than the person who dominated the previous moment. The Guises had had their moment. Catherine had been waiting for hers. Charles IX was 10 years old, and France needed a regent. The woman who had arrived at the French court as a 14-year-old girl with an accent and no allies, who had spent decades being underestimated and overlooked and quietly positioned as irrelevant, was now the most powerful person in France, not officially, not with any title that matched the reality, but in the way that mattered in the making of decisions, the directing of policy, the shaping of what happened next. That was where Catherine had always wanted to be. And that was exactly where she was. For the first time in her life, Catherine de Medici did not have to pretend she was not in charge. After nearly 3 decades of operating through patience, indirection, and the careful cultivation of proximity to people who held authority she was denied, she was now officially formally by documented legal arrangement the regent of France. The 10-year-old Charles IX sat on the throne. Catherine sat next to it and made the decisions. This was, by the standards of her biography so far, a relatively straightforward arrangement, and one she'd been preparing for, consciously or otherwise, since approximately 1533. The France she inherited as regent in December 1560 was not in excellent condition. This is perhaps an understatement on the level of saying that the Titanic had a minor navigation problem. The kingdom had been through years of expensive military campaigns. The royal finances were in a state that would have made any modern accountant reach immediately for something stronger than coffee, and most urgently, most dangerously, the country was fracturing along religious lines in ways that no amount of political skill had yet managed to stop. To understand what Catherine was walking into, you need to understand what had been happening to European Christianity over the preceding 4 decades. Martin Luther had posted his complaints about the Catholic Church in 1517, which is one of those moments that looks like a specific event, but was actually a trigger for an enormously complex process that nobody fully controlled and nobody could fully predict. By 1560, Protestant movements had taken root across northern Europe, had reshaped Germany, had transformed England, and had made substantial inroads into France in the form of Calvinism. French Protestants, called Huguenots, a term whose exact etymology historians still debate with the cheerful persistence of people who enjoy this kind of puzzle, were not a marginal fringe. They were a significant portion of the population, including a notable section of the French nobility, which made them politically impossible to simply ignore. The Huguenot movement in France had grown through the 1540s and 1550s with a speed that alarmed the Catholic establishment and puzzled the monarchy, which had hoped it would either fizzle out on its own or remain confined to social groups that could be managed without too much disruption. It had done neither. By the time Catherine became regent, there were somewhere between 1 and 2 million Huguenots in France. Estimates vary because 16th century census taking was not exactly a precision science, and they were organised, motivated, and increasingly convinced that the French crown was not going to accommodate their existence voluntarily. The Catholic side of this equation was no less organised and no less convinced of its position. The French Catholic establishment, the church hierarchy, the majority of the nobility, the overwhelming majority of the urban population in cities like Paris, viewed Protestantism not merely as theological error, but as a direct threat to the social order. In their framework, religious unity and political stability were not separate things. A kingdom with competing religions was a kingdom with competing loyalties, and competing loyalties were, in the zero-sum thinking of 16th century political culture, essentially the same thing as civil war waiting for a sufficient provocation. Both sides were right about one thing. The situation was genuinely unstable. What they disagreed about was the solution, and the solutions they respectively proposed were, unfortunately, mutually exclusive. The Catholic position was essentially that Protestantism needed to be suppressed not necessarily through the kind of spectacular violence that had characterized the Spanish Inquisition, but firmly and consistently enough that it ceased to be a viable alternative to Catholic practice. The Huguenot position was that they needed legal protection, recognised rights of worship, and some guarantee that the crown would not look the other way while angry mobs destroyed their meeting houses, which had happened with some regularity throughout the 1550s. Catherine's own religious position is one of the more discussed questions about her, and the discussion tends to generate more heat than clarity. She was Catholic, raised Catholic, culturally Catholic, probably genuinely Catholic, in the sense that she observed the forms and participated in the sacraments, and did not privately subscribe to Protestant theology. But she was also, and this is the crucial point, a great deal more interested in political stability than in theological correctness. She had grown up in Renaissance Florence, where the relationship between religion and power was understood in pragmatic rather than purely devotional terms, and she brought that pragmatism to France in ways that made the more fervent members of both camps deeply suspicious of her motives. Fervent people, in any era, tend to find pragmatists untrustworthy, because pragmatists keep making arguments that sound reasonable, but somehow never quite arrive at the conclusion that your side should win completely and immediately. Her approach to the regency, from the first months, reflected this pragmatic orientation. She did not begin by taking a firm position in the religious conflict and building her governance around it. She began by trying to understand the actual state of the kingdom, which was something her predecessors had not always prioritised with equal energy, and by making herself physically present in a way that French monarchs had not consistently managed. The grand tour she undertook between 1564 and 1566 is one of the more underappreciated episodes of her regency, and, honestly, of 16th century French history in general. She travelled through France for nearly 2 years with Charles IX, covering thousands of miles by the standards of an era in which travelling 100 miles was considered a serious undertaking, meeting with local nobles, city officials, regional governors, and ordinary subjects with a frequency and directness that was genuinely unusual for the period. This was not a ceremonial procession, or rather, it was a ceremonial procession in the sense that it involved the appropriate pageantry and display, because projecting royal authority required a certain amount of theatrical effort in the 16th century. But it was also a working tour. Catherine was gathering information about how the kingdom actually functioned, what the regional tensions were, where the religious conflict was most acute, which local figures were managing it reasonably and which were making it worse. The tour was, logistically, a considerable undertaking. The royal court at this point numbered in the hundreds ladies-in-waiting, councillors, guards, servants, officials, diplomats, and the various hangers-on who attached themselves to any significant movement of royal power, and moving all of these people across French terrain was the organisational equivalent of relocating a small town every few days, except that a small town does not also need to conduct formal diplomatic meetings and maintain the appearances of royal dignity while doing so. The roads were what 16th century roads were, which is to say, functional in the loosest possible interpretation of that word. The accommodations range from genuinely comfortable chateaux to establishments that tested the definition of hospitality in interesting ways. Catherine managed it all with an efficiency that impressed contemporaries and that probably owed something to the administrative habits she had developed during years of running a complex household. What she learned on this tour was both useful and sobering. France was not one country in any simple sense. It was a collection of regions with distinct histories, cultures, loyalties, and grievances, held together by the idea of the crown rather than by any seamless administrative reality. The religious divisions were not uniform. In some areas, Catholic and Protestant communities had developed workable local arrangements, not harmonious exactly, but functional, based on practical coexistence rather than principled tolerance. In other areas, the situation was considerably more volatile, with local lords who were using the religious conflict as a vehicle for older feudal grievances, or urban populations where the accumulated resentments of economic stress had fused with religious passion in ways that made both harder to address. She also learned something about herself, or rather confirmed something she had always suspected. She was good at this. She was good at meeting people, at reading rooms, at finding the language that acknowledged a grievance without committing to a remedy that would create 3 new grievances in addressing the first one. She was good at the kind of face-to-face political engagement that required you to be genuinely present, listening, observing, calibrating, responding rather than operating purely through intermediaries and documents. The French court, for all its complexity, had been a closed world. France itself was considerably more varied and considerably more interesting, and Catherine, who had spent decades learning to navigate one very specific social environment, found that the skills transferred. The Edict of January 1562, issued shortly before the Grand Tour was planned, as one of her first significant legislative acts as regent, deserves particular attention because it represents the clearest statement of what Catherine was attempting to accomplish politically in these years. The edict granted Huguenots the right to practice their religion outside town walls and in private within them. It was not full religious freedom in any modern sense, it was a carefully circumscribed set of permissions that tried to acknowledge Protestant existence without validating it in ways that would completely alienate the Catholic establishment. It was, in other words, a compromise, which meant that both sides immediately found reasons to dislike it. The Catholic response ranged from cold disapproval to outright fury, depending on how extreme the Catholic in question was. The idea that Protestant worship should be officially permitted anywhere in France was, for the more committed defenders of Catholic orthodoxy, a concession that bordered on heresy, not theological heresy, but the political heresy of treating a religious error as though it deserved the same respect as correct belief. The Guises, who had been working to position themselves as the champions of Catholic orthodoxy in France, were particularly opposed, partly for genuine religious reasons and partly because the edict reduced the pressure for the kind of forceful suppression of Protestantism that would have required their military leadership. The Huguenot response was not much warmer, though for different reasons. The edict gave them something: recognition, limited protection, a legal basis for their existence, but it gave them considerably less than they needed to feel genuinely secure. Outside town walls was a meaningful restriction in a country where most of the population lived in or near towns. Private worship was a constrained permission in a community that had built its religious life around collective practice. The more pragmatic Huguenot leaders recognized the edict as a step imperfect, insufficient, but a step, while the more committed ones viewed it as an insult dressed up as a concession. What Catherine was attempting with the edict, and with her broader approach to the religious question in these years, was a policy of what historians have sometimes called politique thinking. The idea that the stability of the state should take precedence over the victory of any particular religious faction. The politiques, as a loose tendency rather than an organized movement, argued that a France torn apart by religious civil war was worse for everyone, including the winners, than a France that found some basis for coexistence. This was a minority position in an era when most people assumed that religious truth was singular and that tolerating error was the same as endorsing it. But it was Catherine's position, and she held it with the consistency of someone who had thought it through rather than simply arrived at it by temperament. The problem was that the religious conflict had its own momentum by 1562, and political edicts, however carefully crafted, were not sufficient to contain it. In March 1562, a few months after the January edict, the Duke of Guise and his armed retinue encountered a Huguenot congregation assembled for worship at Vassy in northeastern France. What happened next is one of those historical events where the accounts differ enough that certainty about the details is difficult, but the outcome is not in dispute. A significant number of Huguenots were killed. The massacre at Vassy, as it became known, was either a deliberate attack or a confrontation that escalated badly, depending on which account you find more credible. What it functionally was, regardless of original intent, was the spark that ignited the first of the French wars of religion. Catherine's response to Vassy was instructive. She did not immediately condemn the Guises; she could not afford to, because the Guises commanded the loyalty of a substantial portion of the Catholic nobility, and publicly denouncing them would have accelerated the fracture she was trying to prevent. She did not endorse the massacre; she was not indifferent to the deaths of French subjects, and the political damage of being seen to approve of it would have been considerable. She manoeuvred, as she almost always manoeuvred, in the space between clear positions, trying to prevent the escalation from becoming unmanageable, while managing the competing demands of factions that were rapidly losing interest in compromise. She failed in the immediate term. The First War of Religion began in 1562 and lasted until 1563, when it was ended by the Edict of Amboise, another compromise, another attempt to find a formula that both sides could nominally accept without either side genuinely being satisfied. The pattern of these years' war, negotiation, edict, uneasy peace, renewed tension, war again would repeat itself with depressing regularity over the next decade. There were 8 wars of religion in France between 1562 and 1598, which suggests that whoever was managing the peace negotiations was either very persistent or very optimistic, and possibly both. Catherine was centrally involved in nearly all of these negotiations. She travelled to meeting points, conducted direct discussions with Huguenot leaders, including Gaspard de Coligny, the Admiral of France, and the most significant Protestant military commander, a figure we will meet again in a later chapter, under very different circumstances and with Catholic noble factions. She drafted and redrafted the compromise formulas that each successive edict represented. She worked, consistently and with genuine effort, to find the language and the arrangements that might hold the country together for long enough that the next crisis could be addressed before the previous one had fully resolved. Her meetings with Coligny in this period are particularly interesting because they complicate the narrative that later became standard about their relationship. Coligny was, by most accounts, a man of genuine integrity, a committed Calvinist, a capable military leader, and a political figure who was trying to secure real and lasting protections for the Huguenot community rather than merely tactical advantages. He and Catherine operated from completely different starting assumptions about what France should look like, and yet they found ways to work together during periods when the alternative was open warfare. She respected his intelligence. He, somewhat grudgingly, acknowledged her political effectiveness. This was not friendship. It was the mutual recognition of 2 competent people who were stuck in the same problem and needed each other's cooperation to manage it. The relationship would eventually end in one of the most catastrophic moments of Catherine's career, but in these years of the early Regency, it represented something genuinely constructive. The broader picture of Catherine's regency, stripped of the religious crisis, shows a woman who was an effective administrator in ways that her historical reputation has tended to obscure. She reorganized royal finances with the help of capable treasury officials, not restoring them to health that would have required resources that the wars kept consuming but at least preventing a complete collapse. She maintained France's diplomatic relationships with reasonable competence, keeping the country's foreign policy coherent during a period when internal instability might easily have made it a target for opportunistic intervention by neighbouring powers. She managed the Spanish relationship, which was structurally complicated by the fact that Philip II of Spain was now her son-in-law, and also a committed Catholic monarch who had strong opinions about how France should handle its Protestant problem, opinions that were naturally somewhat different from Catherine's. She also, during these years, built the physical and cultural environment of the French court, in ways that reflected the Renaissance values she'd brought from Florence. She commissioned buildings, supported artists and writers, maintained a court that was, despite everything, a significant cultural centre. This is not irrelevant to the political story. A court that projects cultural confidence projects political confidence, and in a period when France's actual political situation was deeply uncertain, maintaining the appearance of a functioning, sophisticated monarchy mattered for both domestic and foreign audiences. Catherine understood this. She'd grown up in a family that had always understood that cultural patronage was a form of political communication. What she could not fix, despite everything, was the fundamental incompatibility of the 2 religious communities she was trying to hold together. The wars of religion were not, at their root, a problem of bad policy or insufficient negotiating skill. They were the product of a genuine and deep conflict about what France was and should be, and that conflict had structural and emotional dimensions that no edict, however cleverly drafted, could fully address. Catherine grasped this, which is part of what made her approach to it so persistently pragmatic. She was not under the illusion that she was going to solve the religious question. She was trying to manage it, to keep it from consuming the country entirely, to buy time for something she was not always clear what to shift the underlying dynamics. The Grand Tour had shown her the human texture of the problem in ways that made abstract policy considerably more complicated. She had met Huguenot families who were not theological debaters, but ordinary people trying to practice their faith without being harassed. She had met Catholic communities whose fear of Protestant organising was genuine and rooted in real experiences of disruption and violence. She had met local nobles on both sides who were using the religious conflict as cover for very unreligious ambitions involving land, title, and the settling of generations-old scores. The religious wars were a religious conflict, yes, but they were also an economic conflict, a class conflict, a regional conflict, and a conflict between different visions of French identity. and all of these dimensions were happening simultaneously, with no convenient way to address them separately. By the mid-1560s, Catherine had been governing France for approximately 5 years, and the results were mixed in the way that honest assessments of genuinely difficult governance usually are. She had prevented complete collapse, which was not nothing, given the starting conditions. She had maintained enough central authority that France remained a functioning kingdom rather than dissolving into the kind of permanent fragmentation that had destroyed other polities in comparable circumstances. She had conducted a grand tour that gave her, and, through her, the crown a more detailed and grounded understanding of the kingdom than most monarchs of the period bothered to acquire. She had also presided over the beginning of the religious wars and had not found a way to end them. The edicts she negotiated held for months, sometimes for a few years, and then the peace frayed and the killing resumed. The compromises she built were always insufficient for someone, usually for both sides simultaneously, which is either the sign of a good compromise or the sign of an impossible problem, and in this case it was almost certainly the latter. The France that Catherine was governing was, in a sense, ungovernable by the tools available to her or to anyone else for that matter. There was no precedent for managing a large, diverse country through a sustained religious civil conflict without either suppressing one side completely or reaching a genuine accommodation that neither side in France was yet willing to make. She was inventing solutions to problems that had no established playbook, in real time, with a 10-year-old king, inadequate finances, and 2 religious factions that were each convinced that God was personally backing their position. The Regency years were the period when Catherine's capabilities were most fully tested and most fully displayed, and they were also the period when the limits of what those capabilities could achieve became most painfully clear. She was an extraordinary political operator working within a situation that was, in some fundamental respects, beyond any single person's ability to control. That tension between her genuine effectiveness and the structural impossibility of what she was attempting defines this chapter of her life, and it sets the stage for the decisions that would come next, decisions that would be harder and darker, and would follow her through history in ways that none of the careful diplomacy of the Regency years ever quite managed to offset. History has a tendency to collapse complicated people into their most dramatic moments. Mention Catherine de Medici to most people with a passing familiarity with French history, and the association that surfaces first is almost never the woman who spent years attempting genuine religious reconciliation. It is something considerably darker, something involving August 1572, something that we will get to in the next chapter. But before that, significantly before that, there was a Catherine who convened theologians, who travelled personally to negotiate with Protestant leaders, who drafted compromise after compromise in the genuine belief, or at least the genuine hope, that France did not have to choose between its 2 religious communities by destroying one of them. Whether this Catherine was a sincere peacemaker or a pragmatic manager who used the language of reconciliation while pursuing stability above all else, is a question that historians have been arguing about for several centuries without arriving at a consensus, which probably means the answer is both, simultaneously, in proportions that shifted depending on the circumstances. This chapter is about those years, the ones that tend to get skipped in the rush toward the more cinematic events, and about what they reveal of a woman trying to hold together something that may have already been past saving. The Colloquy of Poissy in September 1561 is the clearest single illustration of what Catherine was attempting and why it proved so difficult. The Colloquy, a formal theological conference, which in the 16th century was the equivalent of a very high-stakes interfaith summit, except with considerably more Latin and considerably less media coverage, was Catherine's initiative, organised during the early months of her regency, while France was still in the uneasy pre-war period before the first of the religious conflicts formally began. The idea was straightforward in concept and wildly ambitious in practice. Bring the leading Catholic and Calvinist theologians together in the same room, have them discuss their actual theological disagreements, and see whether common ground could be found. It was, to put it gently, an optimistic proposition. The man Catherine brought in to represent the Calvinist position was Theodore Beza, Calvin's closest associate and the most capable theological debater the Reformed movement had to offer. Beza was brilliant, precise, and possessed of the particular self-assurance of someone who believes he has access to the correct answer, and is genuinely puzzled by why other people can't simply see it. The Catholic side was represented by the Cardinal of Lorraine Charles of Guise, whom we have met before in his capacity as Catherine's political opponent. That Catherine chose to organise a peace conference that required her to rely on Charles of Guise as her Catholic spokesman gives you some sense of the institutional constraints she was working within. The French Catholic establishment was not going to accept a theological representative who wasn't sufficiently authoritative, and authority in 16th century Catholic France ran through people like Charles, whether Catherine found them personally convenient or not. The colloquy lasted approximately 2 weeks, and produced ultimately nothing of practical value. This was not entirely surprising, the theological gulf between Calvinist and Catholic positions on the Eucharist, which is where the most intense disagreement concentrated, was not the kind of thing that could be bridged by a few weeks of conference room debate, any more than you could resolve a fundamental disagreement about the nature of reality by scheduling sufficient meetings. Beza's opening statement, in which he described the Catholic doctrine of the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist as something that needed to be understood spiritually rather than physically, was received by the assembled Catholic clergy with an expression that can only be described as a collective sharp intake of breath. This was, to put it mildly, not the formulation they were prepared to accept, and the conference never quite recovered from its own beginning. What the colloquy of Poissy reveals, however, is not merely a failed negotiation. It reveals something about how Catherine thought about the problem she was facing. She genuinely believed or operated as if she believed, which for practical purposes amounts to the same thing that if the right people could be put in the same room with sufficient structure and good faith, some basis for accommodation could be found. This was a very Renaissance idea, the humanist conviction that reason, properly applied, could find solutions to problems that pure passion and conviction had made intractable. It was also, given the specific theological content of the dispute, probably somewhat optimistic. But it was not stupid, and it was not cynical. It was Catherine trying, with the tools she had, to solve a problem she understood to be existential. On the Protestant side, the spoiler dynamic was somewhat different. The Huguenot military leadership, which by the early 1560s included figures like Condé and Coligny, was not uniformly committed to conflict either. But the Protestant community had genuine and well-founded reasons to distrust any agreement that left them dependent on the Crown's willingness to enforce their protections. They had watched too many local massacres go unpunished, too many promises evaporate under pressure from Catholic grandees, to feel secure in arrangements that lacked real enforcement mechanisms. Their scepticism about Catherine's compromises was not irrational. It was the reasonable scepticism of a minority community that had learned, through repeated experience, that written protections and actual protections were not always the same thing. Catherine understood this dynamic. She was, if nothing else, an acute reader of political incentives, and it contributed to a quality in her peacemaking efforts that critics read as cynicism, but which is perhaps better understood as realism. She did not talk about permanent solutions. She talked about arrangements that might hold long enough for circumstances to shift. She was buying time, always buying time, on the implicit theory that time was something the country needed, and that any pause in active conflict was therefore valuable even if the pause was imperfect. The critics were right that this was not a vision of France transformed. But Catherine's assessment, based on everything she could observe, was that France transformed was not currently available, and France managed was better than France burning. The personal dimension of her peacemaking efforts is often overlooked entirely. Catherine travelled extensively during these years, not just the grand tour of 1564 to 1566, but numerous additional journeys for specific diplomatic purposes. In 1565 she met with the Duke of Alba, Philip II of Spain's most formidable military commander, and the man responsible for the particularly brutal suppression of Protestant rebellion in the Spanish Netherlands. The meeting, at Bayonne in southern France, was organised as a conference between Catherine and her daughter Elizabeth, the Spanish Queen, but its political content was widely understood to involve Spain's position on France's religious conflict. Alba made clear that Spain's preference was for aggressive suppression of French Protestantism. Catherine made equally clear that she was not prepared to adopt that approach, at least not yet, at least not in the form Spain envisioned. The Bayonne meeting produced nothing concrete and alarmed the Huguenot leadership considerably, who interpreted it not entirely without reason as the beginning of a Catholic coordination against them. It was one of those conversations that managed to worry everyone without reassuring anyone, which is not an easy achievement. Her direct negotiations with Huguenot leadership in the early 1560s were conducted with a mixture of personal respect and political caution that is genuinely interesting to observe. Gaspard de Coligny, the Admiral of France and the most significant Protestant military figure, was a man she seems to have regarded with something approaching genuine esteem. Their correspondence from this period suggests a relationship built on mutual recognition of each other's competence and a shared, if differently motivated, desire to prevent the total destruction of the country they were both trying to navigate. Coligny wanted lasting enforceable protections for the Huguenot community. Catherine wanted stability. For stretches of years at a time, these objectives were compatible enough to create real cooperation. The Peace of Amboise in March 1563, which ended the First War of Religion, was largely Catherine's diplomatic achievement. She negotiated it personally, moving between the military commanders and the political representatives of both sides, with the focused determination of someone who understood that the alternative to an imperfect peace was a continued war that France could not afford in any currency, financial, human, or political. The terms were predictably acceptable to nobody in full. Huguenot nobles received relatively broad rights of Protestant worship. Non-noble Huguenots received considerably more restricted permissions. The Catholic establishment received a commitment to restore confiscated church properties. Both sides found reasons to view the terms as insufficient. Catherine signed them anyway, on the entirely defensible grounds that an unsatisfying peace was preferable to a satisfying continuation of the conflict. The peace held for 4 years, which by the standards of the period was a genuinely significant achievement. The Second War of Religion began in 1567, and was brief, ended within months by another round of negotiations, another edict, another set of compromises that satisfied no one. The third began in 1568, and lasted until 1570, when the Peace of Saint-Germain produced the most expansive set of protections for Huguenots that any French edict had yet granted. Catherine was central to those negotiations as well, and the 1570 settlement represented, in some ways, the high watermark of her peacemaking ambition, an attempt to create a genuinely workable framework for Catholic-Protestant coexistence that went further toward acknowledging Huguenot needs than anything that had preceded it. The Peace of Saint-Germain gave Huguenots the right to worship throughout France with only limited restrictions, access to royal courts and public offices, and crucially 4 fortified towns where they could garrison their own troops as security guarantees. This last provision is the one that tells you most about the psychological reality of the situation. The Huguenots needed armed security guarantees because words on paper had repeatedly proven insufficient. Catherine accepted this provision because the alternative was continued war. The Catholic establishment detested it because armed Protestant garrisons on French soil looked, from their perspective, like the beginning of a state within a state. Everyone was right about their own concerns. The settlement was simultaneously the most reasonable arrangement possible, and the one that created the conditions for its own eventual destruction. It is worth pausing here to consider what Catherine was actually experiencing during these years, beyond the political mechanics. She was a woman who had spent her entire life building toward the ability to govern, who had finally achieved that ability, and who was now discovering that governing France in the 1560s was less like executing a plan and more like trying to steer a vehicle with defective brakes down a hill, while passengers argued loudly about where they wanted to go. The compromise edicts she spent so much energy crafting kept failing, not because she was bad at compromise, but because the underlying conflict was deeper than any administrative arrangement could address. She understood this. Her letters from these years have a quality of exhausted clarity. She knew what she was doing wasn't working, she knew why it wasn't working, and she kept doing it because the alternatives were worse. There is something genuinely moving about this period of her life that tends to get lost in the larger narrative. The Colloquy of Poissy, the January Edict, the Peace of Amboise, the 3 subsequent wars, the Peace of Saint-Germain. These are not the actions of a woman who had decided cynically that conflict was useful. They are the actions of a woman who tried, repeatedly and with real effort, to find a way out of a trap that the country had walked into before she had any power to prevent it. She failed. But she failed while trying, which is not the same as not trying, and the distinction matters. The failure was ultimately structural rather than personal. France in the 1560s was not ready for what Catherine was offering, which was essentially a version of the principle that would eventually, after decades of additional violence, become the basis for the Edict of Nantes in 1598, that religious difference did not have to mean political destruction, that Catholics and Protestants could inhabit the same kingdom without one of them having to disappear. This was, in 1562, a radical idea not because it was philosophically inaccessible, but because both religious communities had so thoroughly identified their own survival with the defeat of the other that compromise felt like surrender. Catherine was asking people to accept that survival and victory were not the same thing, in a moment when they were absolutely certain they were. The human cost of this failure is worth being explicit about, because the historical distances involved can make it abstract. The 3 wars of religion that occurred between 1562 and 1570 killed tens of thousands of people, soldiers, certainly, but also civilians caught in the regional violence that accompanied the military conflicts, communities that lost members to the localized massacres that occurred in both directions, families split along religious lines whose members ended up on opposing sides of engagements they may not have chosen. The religious wars were not a clean military affair between organized armies. They were also a texture of daily violence and fear that affected ordinary French life in ways that no formal peace treaty could quickly repair. Catherine saw all of this. She was not governing from a distance sufficient to make the consequences of policy failure invisible. She travelled the country, she met the people, she read the reports. The damage was not abstract to her, and the failure of the peace efforts was not merely a political disappointment. It was the knowledge that real people were suffering the consequences of a conflict that she had tried and failed to prevent. This context matters for understanding what came later. The decisions of 1572 were not made by someone who had been indifferent to violence. They were made by someone who had spent a decade trying to prevent it and had run out of the framework that had been organizing her approach. There is one final piece of the Peacemaker chapter that deserves attention, the 1570 peace, and what it was supposed to achieve. The settlement was accompanied by a diplomatic strategy that was, in conception, one of the more ambitious things Catherine had attempted. If a legal framework for Protestant rights was insufficient on its own, an experience had demonstrated that it was perhaps social integration could reinforce it. Catherine began planning the marriage of her daughter Marguerite to the Huguenot leader Henry of Navarre, who was the most significant Protestant prince in France and the logical focal point for Huguenot political identity. A marriage between a Catholic Valois princess and the Huguenot heir presumptive was either a brilliant bridge-building gesture or a provocation of spectacular ambition, depending on your perspective. Catherine thought it was the former. A substantial portion of Catholic France thought it was the latter, with some additional opinions that are not entirely printable. The wedding was planned for August 1572. The Huguenot leadership, including Coligny, would gather in Paris for the celebration. It was supposed to be the culmination of the peacemaking project, the moment when the political and personal reconciliation Catherine had been attempting to engineer was given physical, ceremonial form. Instead, it became the context for the event that would define her historical reputation for the next 4.5 centuries. The Peacemaker's decade ended in Paris, in August, in a set of decisions that no amount of prior effort could justify, and that all of the prior effort made, in some ways, harder to understand. How a woman who had spent 10 years trying to prevent religious violence arrived at the point she arrived at in August 1572 is not a simple story. But it begins here, in this decade of failed compromises and genuine attempts, in the exhaustion of a political imagination that had been trying to solve an unsolvable problem and had finally tried something else. Paris in August 1572 was, by all accounts, a city that had temporarily lost its mind. The streets were full of Huguenot nobles and their retinues, gathered for what was supposed to be the most symbolically significant wedding of the century, the marriage of Marguerite of Valois, Catholic Princess of France, to Henry of Navarre, the most important Protestant prince in the kingdom. The political logic of the match, as Catherine had designed it, was straightforward. If the leaders of both religious communities were family, perhaps they would find it structurally inconvenient to keep trying to destroy each other. It was, in principle, exactly the kind of bridge-building gesture that her decade of peacemaking had been building toward. In practice, it brought the Huguenot leadership to Paris at precisely the moment when the situation was about to become dramatically and irreversibly worse. To understand what happened on and after August 24, 1572, you need to understand the specific pressure cooker that Paris had become in the weeks before the wedding. The city was deeply, viscerally Catholic, not in the mild Sunday attendance sense, but in the way that 16th century urban Catholicism could be: intense, communal, and profoundly hostile to anything it understood as heresy. The presence of thousands of Huguenot nobles in the city for the wedding had generated a mood that combined religious resentment, economic anxiety about the costs of the visitors, and the particular volatility of a population that had been living with religious civil conflict for a decade and had not developed equanimity about it. Paris was, in the weeks before the massacre, a city waiting for a reason. The reason arrived in the form of a failed assassination attempt. On August 22nd, 2 days before the feast of St. Bartholomew, Gaspard de Coligny, the Admiral of France, the most significant Huguenot military and political leader, the man Catherine had worked with during the peacemaking years, was shot while walking in the streets of Paris. The shot was fired from a window and struck his arm, injuring but not killing him. He survived. The investigation that followed pointed toward the Guise family as the likely organisers of the attempt, which made some sense given the long-standing animosity between Coligny and the Guises. There were old scores between them, including Coligny's alleged involvement in the assassination of Francis, Duke of Guise, a decade earlier. What happened next, in the hours between the failed assassination attempt on the 22nd and the beginning of the massacre on the 24th, is the most debated sequence in Catherine's entire life. The historical sources are contradictory, incomplete, and in many cases produced by people with strong interests in particular versions of events. What is agreed upon is the outcome. What is genuinely uncertain is the decision-making process that produced it. The Huguenot nobles were furious about the attack on Coligny and demanding justice. They were armed and present in significant numbers in a city that was already tense. The Guises, who were the primary suspects in the assassination attempt, were also armed and present, and not remotely apologetic about the situation. Charles IX, who had developed a genuine personal relationship with Coligny, the admiral had become something of a father figure to the young king, which was a dynamic that Catherine found politically concerning and had been managing with limited success, was publicly committed to finding and punishing the perpetrators. The city was a room full of extremely dry wood, with people actively discussing the interesting properties of fire. Catherine convened a council. This is documented. The council met on the night of August 23rd, and it included Catherine, Charles IX, and several of the king's closest advisers. What was said in that room is the question that historians have been arguing about ever since, and there is no clean answer because the sources contradict each other in ways that cannot be fully resolved. What emerged from the council, however, is clear. A decision was made to move against the Huguenot leadership before they could act on their anger about the Coligny assassination attempt. The argument that was apparently made in that room, and here we are working from accounts that were produced after the fact, which means they need to be treated with appropriate caution, was essentially one of preemptive security. The Huguenot nobles were in Paris, armed, angry, and potentially on the verge of taking matters into their own hands. The Guises, who had just tried to kill Coligny, were also in Paris, armed, and not going to simply submit to prosecution. The city itself was a powder keg. In this reading, the decision that was made on the night of August 23rd was a panicked calculation that a controlled removal of the Huguenot leadership was preferable to an uncontrolled explosion that nobody could manage. Whether you find this explanation plausible as the primary driver of what followed depends partly on how you assess the specific evidence, and partly on how you think about the psychology of people making high-stakes decisions under extreme pressure. There are historians who believe the decision was primarily defensive and panicked a catastrophic miscalculation rather than a premeditated plan. There are others who believe it was the product of calculation that went further back than the night of August 23rd, that the wedding had been designed as a trap from the beginning. The evidence supports neither interpretation conclusively, which is why the debate has continued for 4.5 centuries without resolution, which is an impressive run even by historical standards. What began in the early hours of August 24th was an operation that quickly became something far beyond any plan, if a plan had existed. The Guise faction, given what amounted to authorization to act, moved against Coligny first. He was killed in his lodgings and his body thrown from a window, which was both an assassination and a signal. What followed was less an operation and more a cascade. The Catholic population of Paris, which had been in a state of barely contained fury for weeks, received the news that the king had authorised action against the Huguenots and interpreted this as considerably broader permission than any council decision had technically granted. The killing spread through the city over the next several days, and then beyond Paris to other French cities, where local Catholic communities received the news and drew their own conclusions about what was permitted. The estimates of those killed range widely in the historical literature, from a few thousand to considerably higher figures, and the uncertainty reflects both the genuine difficulty of documenting events of this kind and the political interests that have shaped the historical record in different directions. What is not in dispute is the scale of what occurred. It was one of the largest single episodes of violence in French history. It affected communities across the country, and it ended the specific political configuration that the Peace of Saint-Germain had created. Charles IX's response to the unfolding events is one of the more psychologically complex elements of the story. He had, in the immediate aftermath, apparently endorsed what was happening. There are accounts of him appearing at a window and expressing approval, but the accounts are again contradictory, and the young king's actual state of mind during those days is genuinely unclear. What is documented is his subsequent deterioration. Charles IX spent the remaining 2 years of his life in poor health, prone to episodes of what contemporaries described as profound psychological distress, and his final conversations before his death in 1574 reportedly included expressions of anguish about what had occurred. Whether this was guilt, trauma, or the product of the illness that killed him, it does not read like the psychological signature of someone who had enthusiastically planned and executed a premeditated massacre. Catherine's own behaviour in the immediate aftermath is harder to read than Charles's, because she was considerably more practised at not revealing her inner state. She continued governing. She managed the diplomatic response, which required explaining to foreign courts what had happened in terms that were both accurate enough to be credible and framed in ways that did not present the French crown as having simply organised the murder of thousands of its own subjects, a communications challenge that was, to put it mildly, not straightforward. She wrote letters. She conducted meetings. She did what she always did in crises, which was to keep functioning and keep managing while the situation around her was in chaos. What she did not do in any documented form was express regret, at least not in ways that reached the historical record. This silence has been interpreted in every direction, as evidence of cold premeditation, as evidence of political calculation that prevented any public admission of wrongdoing, as evidence of a psychology so thoroughly organised around power that moral reflection was not part of its architecture. None of these interpretations is obviously wrong, and none is obviously complete. What the silence actually represents, in the deepest sense, is probably unknowable. The international response to the massacre was immediate and severe. Protestant Europe was horrified. Elizabeth of England received the French ambassador in court dressed in mourning, which was a diplomatic statement of considerable clarity. William of Orange in the Netherlands, who was engaged in his own conflict with Spanish Catholic forces at the time, used the massacre as a rallying point for Protestant solidarity across the continent. Philip II of Spain, in what was perhaps the most grimly revealing response of all, reportedly laughed when he heard the news, which tells you something about the specific way in which Catherine's action played into the geopolitical dynamics of the period, in ways that she had presumably not intended to be quite so directly legible. The Protestant powers of Europe, who had until August 1572 been willing to work within a framework that included the French crown as a potential mediating force in continental religious politics, recalibrated their assessment of France's reliability with considerable speed. The massacre was not merely a domestic atrocity. It was a statement about what the French crown was and what it was willing to do, and that statement reverberated through European politics for decades. The Huguenot community within France did not collapse after the massacre, which was, from Catherine's perspective, if she had hoped for a definitive solution, a significant operational failure. The killings had removed many of the senior military and political leaders, but they had not destroyed the movement. They had, however, destroyed any remaining Huguenot confidence that accommodation with the crown was possible. The 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th wars of religion that followed in the remaining years of the 16th century were fought by a Protestant community that had lost whatever residual trust it might have had in negotiated settlements. The massacre had made Catherine's specific approach to the religious conflict the decade of compromise edicts, the attempt to find workable coexistence frameworks permanently unavailable as a method. Nobody on the Huguenot side was going to trust a compromise offer from the French crown again, not after what had happened in August 1572. This is the most important thing to understand about why the massacre represented a point of no return beyond the immediate horror of what it was. It did not solve the religious problem, it did not even reduce the scale of the religious conflict. If anything, the remaining wars were more intractable than the earlier ones, precisely because the possibility of trust had been eliminated. What it did was close off the one approach that had any realistic chance of eventually producing stability, which was the approach Catherine herself had been pursuing for the previous decade. She had, in a single catastrophic decision made under conditions of extreme pressure and probable panic, destroyed the political framework that she had spent years building. Whether this was what she intended is, as established, contested. Whether she understood in the immediate aftermath what she had done to her own project is less documented but probably more answerable. Catherine was not a person who failed to understand the political consequences of events. She had spent 50 years developing exactly this kind of analytical capacity. It is difficult to imagine that she did not, within a relatively short time, grasp the full scope of what had been lost, not just in moral terms, but in the practical terms that were the language she thought in. The mechanism by which the massacre became specifically associated with Catherine in the historical imagination, rather than being understood as a collective failure involving multiple actors, is itself an interesting story. The Guises had organised the assassination attempt on Coligny and had conducted the initial killings. Charles IX had, in some form, authorised what followed. The Catholic population of Paris and other cities had done the actual killing, acting on their own religious passion rather than following specific royal instructions. The event was the product of a system, not a single decision by a single person. But Catherine was the one who was most systematically blamed, and the reasons for this are layered. She was the most powerful figure in the French court. She had been governing France, in practical terms, for over a decade. She was Italian, and the Italian poisoner stereotype was available as a ready-made framework for interpreting her actions in the worst possible light. She was a woman who had held power in a world that was deeply uncomfortable with women holding power, and women who held power and did bad things were, in the cultural imagination of the period, almost automatically witches, poisoners, and conspirators rather than politicians who made disastrous miscalculations. The black legend that formed around her, the Dark Queen, the scheming Italian, the architect of massacre, was built from real events, real decisions and real responsibility, but it was also shaped by the specific filters through which a woman in power was seen and judged. The men who were equally or more directly involved in what happened, the Guise brothers, who organised the assassination attempt, the Parisian clergy who inflamed their congregations, the local leaders who extended the violence to the provinces received considerably less historical censure, which is not a pattern unique to this specific event. The documentary record of the period is full of brutal acts by powerful men that have been absorbed into history as the normal violence of an abnormal time, while Catherine's involvement has been treated as something specially monstrous. This does not mean she was not responsible. She was. But the specific shape of her historical reputation owes as much to the categories available for judging her as it does to her actual actions. What the massacre did to Catherine personally, not politically, not diplomatically, but to the woman who had spent a decade genuinely trying to prevent something like this, is perhaps the question the historical record is least equipped to answer. Her correspondence from the following months does not include anything that reads as private grief or self-examination, but correspondence from this period was a public document in ways that personal diaries are not, and Catherine was not a person who wrote her private thoughts in forms that were likely to be preserved and circulated. The absence of documented remorse is not evidence of its absence. What is documented is that she kept going. She managed the diplomatic fallout. She continued the regency for Charles IX, whose health was deteriorating, and began the complex management of the transition to Henry III. She negotiated further, continued to look for frameworks, increasingly limited frameworks, with a Protestant community that was no longer interested in trusting royal promises that might reduce the violence of the remaining wars. She worked, because working was what she did, and because there was nothing else available. The point of no return is called that not because it is the end of the story. Catherine had 17 more years to live after August 1572, and they were not empty years. It is called the point of no return because certain possibilities closed permanently. The possibility of being remembered primarily as the woman who held France together during its most dangerous religious crisis, rather than the woman associated with its worst atrocity that closed. The possibility of the compromise framework she had spent a decade building, surviving long enough to become the basis for genuine stability that closed. The possibility of trust between the French crown and the Huguenot community, which was the foundation everything else had been built on, that closed definitively on the morning of August 24th, 1572. The wedding of Marguerite and Henry of Navarre, the event that had brought everyone to Paris, did technically take place. Henry survived. He was kept, more or less under protection, in the Louvre and eventually converted to Catholicism, an episode he handled with the pragmatic flexibility of a man who had just watched thousands of his co-religionists be killed and understood the relevant lesson. The marriage that was supposed to symbolize reconciliation became instead the frame for the event that made reconciliation impossible, which is the kind of historical irony that is genuinely too perfect to have been invented. What Paris looked like in the days after the massacre, the physical, material reality of what the city had become, is something the contemporary accounts describe with a directness that is difficult to read even across 4 centuries. Life resumed, markets reopened, the diplomatic correspondence continued. Catherine received ambassadors and discussed policy, and managed the ordinary business of the French state with the composure that had been her most consistent public characteristic for 50 years. The machinery of governance did not stop because something terrible had happened. It rarely does. This is perhaps the most quietly disturbing thing about the whole episode. Not the violence, which was the product of a specific and terrible moment, but the continuation afterward, the administrative normalcy that followed catastrophe, the way the mechanisms of power simply kept operating as if the ground had not fundamentally shifted beneath them. It had shifted. Catherine knew it had shifted. The France she was governing after August 1572 was a different country from the one she had been trying to build, and the difference was not going to be repaired by any edict, however cleverly drafted, or any diplomatic skill, however well applied. Something had been broken that was not going to be fixed in her lifetime. The remaining years of her story take place in the shadow of that knowledge, managing consequences rather than building possibilities, holding together what could be held together and watching, with the particular clarity of someone who had always understood the stakes, what could not. There is a particular kind of Pyrrhic outcome that history serves up, with some regularity, the victory that costs more than defeat would have, the general who wins the battle and loses the army, the surgeon who saves the patient from the illness and kills them with the treatment. Catherine de Medici's later years present a version of this pattern that is, even accounting for the fact that history is full of such stories, unusually complete in its irony. She spent her life protecting the French throne, ensuring the survival of the Valois dynasty, maintaining the coherence of royal authority through decades of crisis. She largely succeeded. The throne survived. The dynasty endured, at least for her lifetime, and in the process of saving it, she presided over the systematic destruction of almost everything that had made France worth ruling. Start with the economy, because the economic consequences of the wars of religion are perhaps the least dramatic and the most thoroughly devastating element of what happened to France between 1562 and the end of Catherine's life in 1589. The French economy of the mid-16th century was, by the standards of the period, genuinely impressive. France was the most populous country in Western Europe. Estimates suggest somewhere between 15 and 20 million people, which dwarfed England and made France roughly comparable in scale to the entire Iberian Peninsula combined. It had a sophisticated agricultural base, a developed system of internal trade routes, thriving manufacturing centres in cloth, metalwork and luxury goods, and commercial networks that connected it to the Mediterranean trade world and the emerging Atlantic economy simultaneously. Paris was one of the largest cities in Europe. The Loire Valley was a genuine centre of architectural and artistic production. The country, in other words, had real economic foundations, and the mid-16th century should have been, in the ordinary course of events, a period of continued development. The wars of religion destroyed these foundations with a thoroughness that took generations to repair. The mechanism was not primarily direct military destruction, though that was real enough in the regions where armies marched and sieges occurred. The deeper damage was commercial. The trade networks that had been built over generations depended on trust and predictability, merchants extending credit, suppliers fulfilling contracts, buyers showing up at markets on the expected dates. Religious civil conflict destroyed all three simultaneously. Catholic merchants stopped doing business with Huguenot suppliers and vice versa, not necessarily out of pure ideology, but out of the entirely rational calculation that business relationships with members of the opposing religious community had become legally and physically risky. The mixed commercial networks that had characterized French trade for decades, networks where Catholic and Protestant merchants had worked alongside each other because competence and reliability were more commercially relevant than religious affiliation, collapsed under the pressure of conflict. The tax base that funded royal government followed the commercial networks into deterioration, with predictable consequences for the crown's ability to do anything. France in the 1570s and 1580s was essentially bankrupt in the sense that the gap between what the state needed to function and what it could actually collect had become structurally unbridgeable. Catherine spent enormous energy during these years attempting to manage the royal finances, but managing bankruptcy is not the same as solving it, and the specific form of French state finance heavily dependent on loans from Florentine and Genoese banking families, collateralized against future tax revenues that kept failing to materialize, created a debt spiral that consumed resources needed for everything else. The irony of a woman whose family had essentially invented modern European finance presiding over the financial collapse of the kingdom she governed is not subtle, though it is probably the kind of irony that would not have struck Catherine as particularly amusing at the time. The intellectual world suffered damage that was less quantifiable, but arguably more lasting. France in the 1550s had been a genuine centre of European intellectual life. The humanist tradition that Catherine had brought with her from Florence found fertile ground in a country that already had strong traditions of learning. The University of Paris was one of the oldest and most prestigious in Europe. Montpellier was a centre of medical science that attracted students from across the continent, and the network of smaller colleges and schools that supported them had been growing throughout the early 16th century. The printing industry, which had exploded across France after Gutenberg's innovations filtered through from Germany, had created a genuine public sphere of intellectual exchange: books, pamphlets, correspondence networks, the infrastructure of what we might recognize as an early version of a learned community that crossed national boundaries. The wars of religion turned this infrastructure into a propaganda machine, and then progressively dismantled even that. The printing presses that had produced humanist scholarship and literary experimentation began producing, with considerably more commercial and political incentive, religious polemic. The pamphlet wars that accompanied the military conflicts were, in some respects, the 16th century's version of an extremely toxic social media ecosystem. High volume, high emotion, minimal commitment to accuracy, and deeply effective at polarizing audiences who were already inclined towards strong positions. The sophisticated reading public that had consumed Rabelais and Ronsard and the works of the Pléiade poets found itself instead consuming an endless stream of material arguing, with varying levels of literary quality, that the other religious community was composed of monsters, heretics, and people whose continued existence was a theological affront. The specific human cost of French intellectual life is most visible in the emigrations. France's wars of religion produced one of the larger voluntary exoduses of educated people in European history, driven by the simple calculation that living somewhere else was considerably preferable to remaining in a country that was intermittently engaged in killing members of your religious community. Huguenot scholars, craftsmen, physicians and merchants left for Geneva, for the Dutch Republic, for England, for the German Protestant states, taking with them skills, knowledge, capital, and connections that France would spend the better part of the following century trying to replace. The revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685, which would drive a second wave of Huguenot emigration under Louis XIV, is the more famous episode of this kind, but the wars of religion had established the pattern a century earlier and had already done substantial damage to France's human capital base before the 17th century arrived. The architectural losses were real and in some respects peculiarly symbolic. France in the mid-16th century was in the middle of one of its great building periods. The Renaissance had arrived from Italy, partly through Catherine's own influence and patronage, and the Loire Valley Chateau, the early work on the Louvre, the spread of Italian architectural ideas into provincial French building represented a genuine flourishing of the built environment. Wars are not kind to buildings, and the French religious wars were no exception. Churches were destroyed or repurposed. Chateaux were garrisoned and damaged. The construction projects that Catherine and earlier French monarchs had commissioned slowed or stopped as resources dried up and the skilled craftsmen who executed them scattered. Some of the architectural losses were irreplaceable buildings that existed in that specific moment of stylistic creativity and that were not rebuilt when the violence eventually ended. Catherine herself, through her patronage, had been one of the primary drivers of this building program, and the gap between what she had been trying to create and what the wars had produced was visible in the physical landscape of France in a way that her political failures were not. You could look at a damaged chateau, or a half-finished construction project, or a workshop that had been abandoned when its craftsmen fled, and see directly what the conflict had cost. The contrast with what had been planned, the cultural ambition she had imported from Florence and tried to transplant into French soil, was literal as well as metaphorical. The university system's transformation is worth examining in more specific detail because it illustrates the mechanism by which the intellectual damage occurred. The University of Paris in the 1560s and 1570s became, progressively, a centre of the most aggressive Catholic orthodoxy in France, not because its scholars were uniformly zealots, but because the institutional pressure to demonstrate loyalty to the Catholic cause and to identify any deviation from it as potential heresy transformed the culture of intellectual inquiry in ways that took generations to undo. Scholars who might have pursued the kinds of syncretic humanist inquiries that characterized the early 16th century's best intellectual work found that such inquiries now carried political risk. The space for the kind of curious, undirected learning that produces genuinely original thinking, the space that Catherine herself had grown up in Florence, and had tried to recreate at the French court, contracted dramatically under the pressure of religious conflict. Montaigne, writing his essays in the 1570s and 1580s in his tower in the Dordogne while France was tearing itself apart around him, is perhaps the most eloquent witness to what was being lost. He was a Catholic who had Huguenot friends and relatives, a humanist who was genuinely committed to intellectual inquiry, a man who watched his country's religious wars with the pained clarity of someone who understood exactly what was being destroyed and could not stop it. His essays are, among many other things, a sustained argument for the value of intellectual tolerance and the possibility of holding complex, uncertain positions in a world that was demanding simple, certain ones, and they were written by a man who knew that his audience was getting smaller. With every year the wars continued because the readers who could appreciate that kind of argument were dying, leaving, or being silenced. Catherine had known Montaigne. She had met him, corresponded with members of the same intellectual circles, and been associated with the humanist project of which he was a late and extraordinary flowering. The distance between the cultural world she had been trying to build and the one that actually emerged from the wars of religion is perhaps nowhere more precisely measured than in the contrast between the France she had envisioned intellectually sophisticated, culturally ambitious, capable of housing both religious communities within a framework of royal authority and humanist tolerance, and the France that Montaigne was documenting from his tower, deeply uncertain about whether the kind of thinking he was practicing had a future. The social fabric damage is harder to quantify than the economic or intellectual losses, but it was real and lasting. Communities that had been mixed in which Catholic and Protestant families had lived alongside each other, done business together, sometimes intermarried, were fragmented by a decade and more of conflict in ways that created lasting patterns of suspicion and separation. The specific social trust that makes ordinary civic life functional, the assumption that your neighbour's religious identity does not automatically make them your enemy, had been damaged at a level that no peace treaty could quickly repair. People who had watched their neighbours killed, or who had fled their communities, or who had participated in violence against the other community, did not simply return to normal relations when the next edict announced another negotiated peace. The psychological damage of sustained civil conflict operates on longer timescales than the political damage, and it was accumulating throughout these years in ways that would shape French society well into the following century. Catherine's personal relationship with all of this destruction is genuinely painful to trace, because it requires holding two things in mind simultaneously: her genuine commitment to the cultural and intellectual world that was being destroyed, and her role in the decisions that accelerated its destruction. She was not indifferent to what was happening to France. She had spent her childhood in the most culturally alive city in Europe. had carried that inheritance into France, had spent decades as a patron of art, architecture and learning, had built gardens and collected paintings and supported poets and commissioned buildings with the energy of someone who genuinely believed that cultural vitality was part of what a kingdom was for. The France she was watching deteriorate in the 1570s and 1580s was not an abstraction to her. It was the country she had been trying, for 50 years, to make into something worthy of its potential. And yet the decision she had made, the choice of managed conflict over genuine accommodation, the willingness to use religious tension as a political tool when it was convenient, the catastrophic decisions of August 1572 had contributed directly to the deterioration she was watching. This is not to say she caused the wars of religion. The structural conditions that produced them predated her regency and were beyond any single person's ability to prevent. But her choices had shaped how the conflict developed, and the specific form of the damage, the systematic destruction of the mixed, tolerant, intellectually ambitious France she had been trying to build bore in part her fingerprints. There is a specific economic dimension worth adding here that is often overlooked in the political narrative. The Huguenot community in France was, disproportionately to its size, concentrated in exactly the sectors of the economy that drove growth and innovation. Craftsmen, merchants, skilled textile workers, printers, physicians. The Huguenot network had a higher concentration of economically productive middle-class and artisan-class people than the Catholic majority, partly because the reform movement in France had found particularly fertile ground among the literate urban commercial classes. When the wars of religion drove these people out of the economy through direct violence, through flight, through the collapse of the commercial networks that had sustained them, France lost not just individuals but the specific economic capabilities they represented. The silk industry that had been developing in Lyon, partly through Huguenot commercial expertise, contracted. The publishing industry in several French cities, where Protestant printers had been disproportionately represented, was disrupted. These were not catastrophic individual losses, but they accumulated into a pattern of economic damage that was structurally significant. Catherine understood this. Her Italian background gave her a clearer view of the relationship between commercial vitality and political power than many of her French advisors possessed. The Medici had built their influence on exactly this kind of economic foundation, and she knew from having grown up inside the most sophisticated commercial political operation in Europe that kingdoms which destroyed their productive classes were kingdoms that eventually ran out of the resources to maintain themselves. This knowledge presumably made watching it happen all the more frustrating, since the tools available to her for preventing it were limited by the same structural constraints that had limited everything else she'd tried to do. The physical state of Paris itself in the 1580s tells the story more concisely than any analysis. The city that had been, in the 1550s, one of the great capitals of European culture, full of building projects, intellectual activity, court patronage of the arts, the energy of a place that knew it was at the centre of something significant, had become, by the time of Catherine's final years, a city under the control of the Catholic League, a radical faction so extreme in its religious politics that it was effectively at war with its own king. Henry III, Catherine's surviving son and the last Valois king, was reduced in his final years to ruling a France in which his own capital city had been taken over by people who considered him insufficiently Catholic. This is the kind of political outcome that requires a genuinely spectacular sequence of bad developments to achieve. The Catholic League deserves a moment of attention because it represents, in a sense, the final expression of the political dynamic that Catherine had spent decades trying to manage. The League was organised around the Guise family, yes, the same Guises, still operating, still pursuing their vision of Catholic France through increasingly radical means, and it commanded the loyalty of the most fervent Catholic elements of French society, including a Paris populace that had been radicalised by decades of religious conflict into something that made the earlier phases of the wars look almost moderate by comparison. The League's vision of France was not Catherine's vision of France. It was not anyone's vision of France who had grown up in the humanist tradition, who valued intellectual inquiry, who believed that royal authority should be strong and secular enough to contain religious faction, rather than being captured by it. It was in a real sense the political culture that Catherine's entire career had been organised against, and it had won. It had won not because Catherine had failed to fight it, but because the conditions that produced it had been accumulating throughout the wars of religion, in ways that outpaced her ability to manage them. Every wave of religious violence, every failed peace, every compromise that collapsed, had added material to the foundation of the radical Catholic movement. The massacre of August 1572 had, paradoxically, contributed to the League's eventual power. It had radicalized both religious communities simultaneously, making the moderates on both sides who might have supported Catherine's compromise approach increasingly irrelevant, and empowering the extremists who had never been interested in compromise in the first place. The civilization that Catherine had been trying to build, the France of the Pléiade poets, of the Loire Château, of the humanist scholarship and the mixed commercial networks and the cultural ambition that Renaissance Florence had inspired, was not dead at the end of her life. It survived in fragments, in the works that had already been produced, in the people who had managed to weather the storm, in the institutional memory of a country that had been capable of extraordinary things. But it was badly damaged, and the damage was not the product of foreign invasion or natural catastrophe, but of internal choices made by French people, including some made by Catherine herself. The throne survived. That was what she had set out to protect, and that was what she had accomplished. Henry III was King of France. The Valois dynasty was still on the throne, though it would not remain there much longer. Henry would be assassinated in 1589, a few months after Catherine's own death, and the dynasty would end with him. The institution of the French monarchy survived and would continue under the Bourbon line into the following centuries. Catherine had kept the machinery running. She had not, in the end, been able to keep the country it was supposed to govern from becoming something she would barely have recognised from the vantage point of her arrival in France in 1533. The price of the victory was, measured in these terms, extraordinarily high. Higher, perhaps, than any victory of that kind is worth. But this is the retrospective judgment of history, which has the luxury of knowing how the story turned out. Catherine, governing in real time with incomplete information and genuine constraints, had been making decisions that seemed at each individual moment to be the least bad option available. That the accumulation of least bad options can produce outcomes that are in aggregate terrible is one of the more sobering lessons that history offers, and Catherine's story offers it with particular clarity. She had wanted to protect something worth having. She had kept the form of it alive while much of the substance drained away. Whether there was a version of her story in which the substance could have been preserved along with the form is the question that her biography leaves permanently open, not because the answer is unknowable in principle, but because the answer depends on counterfactual possibilities that the actual history closed off one by one, decision by decision, war by war, until the France that existed at the end of her life was the only France that could have existed, given everything that had happened to get there. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that comes not from doing too much, but from outlasting too much, from surviving long enough to watch everything you built, everyone you loved, and every version of the future you had planned for simply cease to exist before you do. Catherine de Medici's final decade has this quality throughout. She was not idle in her last years, she was constitutionally incapable of idleness, and she continued to negotiate, to travel, to write letters, to attempt to manage a France that was progressively less manageable. But the energy behind all of this activity had changed. She was no longer building, she was holding on, and increasingly she was holding on to things that were already gone. The France of the 1580s was a country that had moved past the point where Catherine's particular skills were the skills most needed. She had always been at her best in the spaces between open conflict, the negotiations, the diplomatic manoeuvring, the management of competing factions through patience and information, and the careful application of incentives. The France of the 1580s had fewer and fewer such spaces. The Catholic League, now functioning as a parallel power structure with its own administration and military capacity, had removed the French crown from effective control of large portions of the country. Henry III, Catherine's last surviving son, and the king she had invested the most hope in, was governing a kingdom that increasingly governed itself without his permission, which is not the kind of arrangement that tends to end well for the monarch involved. Henry III deserves a fuller portrait than he typically receives, because he has been persistently caricatured in ways that obscure the actual tragedy of his position. He was, by the standards of a dynasty that had produced Francis II and Charles IX, a capable man, intelligent, genuinely interested in governance, possessed of cultural sophistication that would have made him an excellent peacetime king in a period that France was not, unfortunately, experiencing. He was also deeply attached to a circle of favourites, young courtiers whose influence over him struck the Catholic establishment as both politically inappropriate and personally scandalous. The League's propaganda against Henry was relentless and personal, in ways that went beyond ordinary political opposition. They questioned not just his policies, but his basic fitness to rule, in language that was designed to delegitimize him entirely in the eyes of the French Catholic public. Catherine had watched all of this with the particular helplessness of a parent who understands exactly what is happening to their child and cannot stop it. She had spent decades managing the political environment around her sons, shaping the information they received, protecting them from the worst consequences of their own limitations. With Henry III, this became progressively less possible as the 1580s advanced. He was an adult king with his own council and his own preferences, and the relationship between them always the warmest she had with any of her children. The one she had invested most in had the texture of two people who cared deeply about each other and could not quite agree on how to navigate the disaster they were both inside. She continued to travel for diplomatic purposes well into her 60s, which in the 16th century was an age when most people who had survived to reach it were not being asked to cross France in winter for difficult negotiations. In 1586, she made a journey to meet with Henry of Navarre, the Huguenot leader, her former son-in-law through the marriage that had preceded the massacre of 1572, now the heir presumptive to the French throne, in the absence of any surviving Valois male heirs. The negotiation was about the terms under which Henry of Navarre might be reconciled with the crown, an arrangement that was becoming increasingly unavoidable as the dynastic arithmetic became clearer. The talks failed. Henry of Navarre was not prepared to convert to Catholicism. At that point he would eventually famously do exactly this in 1593, with the observation that Paris was worth a mass, but in 1586 he was not yet ready for that particular pragmatic calculation. Catherine returned to court having achieved nothing, in weather that was, by all accounts, genuinely terrible, having travelled distances that were genuinely inadvisable for a woman of her age and health. The physical toll of these years was becoming visible in ways that Catherine's earlier decades had not shown. She had always been stout. Portraits from even her middle years show a woman who was built for endurance rather than elegance, and the 1580s added the accumulated weight of age, illness, and the specific physical wear of 50 years of political activity that had involved extensive travel, irregular sleep, and the kind of sustained stress that is not kind to the human body regardless of how well organised the mind managing it might be. She suffered from a persistent cough that grew worse over the years, joint pain that made the travel she could not stop doing increasingly difficult, and a general physical deterioration that contemporaries noted with varying degrees of sensitivity. What she did not do, even in these years, was stop working. Her correspondence from the late 1580s is, in volume and detail, comparable to her correspondence from the height of her regency letters to Henry III, to foreign ambassadors, to regional governors, to the various political figures she was attempting to manage or influence. The letters have a quality of slightly accelerated urgency, as if she understood that time was short and there was still so much that needed to be said and arranged. They also have occasionally flashes of something that is rare in the documentary record of her life, unguarded frustration. Not the cold, strategic management of difficulty that characterizes most of her political writing, but genuine human frustration at a situation that was not responding to any of the tools she had spent her life developing. The loss of her children was the constant thread through all of this. Francis II had died in 1560, Charles IX in 1574. Her daughter Elizabeth had died in 1568, Claude in 1575. By the late 1580s, of the 10 children she had delivered between 1543 and 1556, she had outlived 7. The 3 who survived were Henry III, Marguerite estranged from Henry of Navarre, and living in circumstances that were complicated even by the remarkable standards of 16th century royal marriages, and Hercule Francis, Duke of Anjou, who had been Catherine's last diplomatic instrument, the son she had deployed as a candidate for various European thrones and military commands, with the persistent optimism of a woman who had not yet run out of children to work with. Hercule Francis died in 1584 at 29, from a fever that the period's medicine could not address. He left no heirs. With his death, the question of Valois succession became not a future problem but an immediate one. Henry III had no children, and there were now no other Valois males to produce them. The death of Hercule Francis appears to have affected Catherine more deeply than the political record fully captures. He had been the youngest, the one who had never quite fulfilled the expectations she had for him. He was neither the military commander nor the European monarch she had tried to make him, but he was also the last, and his death closed a chapter that had organised her life since 1543. She was now the mother of one surviving son, a son who was childless and increasingly embattled, governing a country that contained an armed faction, actively working to remove him from the throne. The dynastic project that had been the frame of her political life for 40 years was, as of 1584, functionally over. The Valois line was going to end with Henry III. The only questions remaining were when and under what circumstances. She understood this with complete clarity. Catherine was not a person who managed difficult realities through denial. She had spent her whole life doing the opposite, forcing herself to see situations as they actually were rather than as she would have preferred them to be. The Valois dynasty was ending. France's future lay with a Protestant heir from a collateral branch of the royal family, and the only way to make that transition workable was to engineer a conversion and a reconciliation that neither the heir nor the Catholic establishment was currently willing to accept. This was, even by the standards of the problem she had spent her career addressing, a genuinely intractable situation. She attempted to address it anyway, because attempting was what she did. The last years of her relationship with Henry III were marked by a combination of genuine closeness and increasing divergence. Henry was making decisions about his favourites, about his religious practices, about his approach to the League that Catherine disagreed with and could not fully influence. He was not Charles IX, who had been genuinely dependent on her guidance for most of his reign. Henry III was a man who made his own choices, sometimes poor ones, and who could not always be redirected by the arguments his mother brought to him. She continued to bring them regardless. The letters she wrote him in the late 1580s, advising, analysing, sometimes pleading, read as the correspondence of a woman who knew she was losing her audience, but could not stop making her case, because making her case was the only response available to the situation. The Catholic League's escalation in 1588 produced what contemporaries called the Day of the Barricades, a Parisian uprising, in May of that year, during which the League effectively seized control of the capital, forcing Henry III to flee the city. This was, as political humiliations go, a fairly complete one. The King of France, forced out of his own capital by his own subjects, was not in a position that suggested a bright immediate future. Henry III responded by having the Duke of Guise, Henry of Guise, the son of the Francis Duke of Guise, who had been Catherine's adversary in the 1560s, assassinated in December 1588. He also had the Cardinal of Guise killed the following day, presumably on the theory that if you were going to make that particular decision, you might as well be thorough about it. The assassinations produced exactly the reaction that anyone with a basic understanding of French Catholic political culture could have predicted: outrage, condemnation, and the consolidation of the League support. The Pope excommunicated Henry III. The University of Paris, that institution whose intellectual transformation Catherine had watched with such sadness, formally declared that French subjects were released from their obligation to obey the king, which was the 16th century's version of a very serious political statement. Catherine, who had spent decades trying to manage the Guise family rather than confront them directly, and who had watched her son take the approach of direct confrontation, with consequences that she had probably foreseen better than he had, was by this point seriously ill. She died on January 5th, 1589, at the Château de Blois, at 69 years old, which was, in the 16th century, a genuinely exceptional lifespan for someone who had lived the kind of life she had lived. The immediate cause of her death was pleuritis, an inflammation of the lining around the lungs, which had developed from the persistent respiratory illness she had been managing for years. She died surrounded by, at most, a handful of people, in a chateau that had been a centre of royal power for decades, and that now sat in the middle of a country in which the king had just assassinated two of the most powerful Catholic nobles in France, and was governing, if governing is the right word, from a position of almost complete political isolation. The contemporary accounts of her death are, taken together, one of the more quietly devastating documents in the historical record. The court's response was not grief. It was not even the formal, performative mourning that the death of a former regent and queen mother would ordinarily have generated. It was, by multiple accounts, Something closer to indifference, a brief notation that the old queen had died, a quick calculation about what this meant for various ongoing situations, and a rapid return to the much more immediately pressing question of what Henry III was going to do next. One account, possibly exaggerated but probably not entirely fictional, suggests that her body lay unattended for some time before the appropriate arrangements were made, which is the kind of detail that is too specific to be entirely invented and too pointed to be included accidentally. She had outlived her usefulness to the people around her, which is the specific form that invisibility takes at court. For 50 years, Catherine had been valuable as a source of information, of access, of political judgment, of the kind of management that kept difficult situations from becoming impossible ones. In January 1589, none of that was any longer operative. Henry III was past the point where his mother's advice could change his trajectory. The religious wars had moved beyond the phase where Catherine's particular skills negotiation, compromise, the careful cultivation of the middle ground were the relevant tools. The dynasty she had protected was 8 months from its end. There was nothing left that she could do that anyone needed her to do, and the court, which had always been a place where value was calculated in real time and with considerable efficiency, registered this fact in the most direct way available to it, by not particularly noticing her absence. She was buried initially at Saint-Sauveur in Blois, a temporary arrangement, since the plan had always been for eventual burial at Saint-Denis, the royal necropolis outside Paris where the French monarchs were traditionally interred. She had, in fact, commissioned her own tomb years earlier, a marble monument designed by Germain Pilon that was intended to stand alongside Henry II's in the royal basilica. The tomb was finished. Catherine was not buried in it for years because Paris was controlled by the League, and bringing the body of the former Queen Mother into the city was politically complicated in ways that the immediate post-death period could not easily resolve. She was, in a final posthumous irony, shut out of Paris even in death, the city that had defined so much of her political life, declining to receive her remains with any particular urgency. Henry III was assassinated by a Dominican friar named Jacques Clément on August 1st, 1589, 8 months after his mother's death. He died at 47 without heirs, and the Valois dynasty ended with him precisely as Catherine had understood it would. The crown passed to Henry of Navarre, who became Henry IV, converted to Catholicism in 1593, and eventually issued the Edict of Nantes in 1598, the religious settlement that finally, after 36 years of war, created the workable framework for Catholic-Protestant coexistence in France that Catherine had been attempting to engineer since 1561. The framework that Henry IV built in 1598 was, in its basic architecture, not entirely different from what Catherine had been trying to construct with the Peace of Saint-Germain in 1570. It required a different king, a different political context, and several more decades of terrible violence to become possible. The specific loneliness of Catherine's final years is worth dwelling on for a moment, because it is easy to lose it in the political narrative. She had organised her entire life around her children, and she had watched most of them die. She had organised her political life around the Valois dynasty, and she had watched it collapse in slow motion while she was still alive to observe it. She had organised her cultural ambitions around the possibility of a France that combined political stability with intellectual vitality, and she had watched that possibility drain away over decades of conflict. Everything she had worked for was either gone or going, and she was still there, still writing letters, still attempting negotiations, still making arguments that fewer and fewer people were interested in hearing. There is a quality to the correspondence of her final years that is different from anything earlier in the record not despairing, because Catherine was not constitutionally capable of despair in the ordinary sense, but quieter, as if the relentless forward momentum that had characterized her political life was finally running out of places to go. She was still sharp. She was still accurate in her assessments. She was still, in her letters to Henry III, providing analysis that was better than most of what he was receiving from other sources. But the letters have occasionally a valedictory quality, the quality of someone who is saying things they want to have said, whether or not they will be heard, because the opportunity to say them is running out. She had arrived in France in 1533 as a 14-year-old girl with no allies, no influence, no protection beyond the political arrangement that had delivered her, and no particular reason to expect that things would go well. She left it in January 1589 as a 69-year-old woman who had governed one of the largest kingdoms in Europe for the better part of 3 decades, had raised 3 kings, had negotiated more peace treaties than anyone could conveniently count, and had outlasted virtually everyone who had underestimated her. She had not built the France she wanted. She had not protected the dynasty she had given her life to. She had not prevented the catastrophe of 1572 or the slow destruction of the cultural world she had tried to create. But she had survived everything that had been thrown at her with a consistency that is, even accounting for all the failures and all the costs, genuinely extraordinary. The court's indifference to her death was real. It was also, in a specific way, a final confirmation of something she had understood since the beginning. Courts are not sentimental. They are not organised around loyalty to individuals. They are organised around power, access and utility, and when those things are gone, the person associated with them becomes invisible with remarkable speed. Catherine had known this since she was 14 years old and had arrived at a court that looked at her and calculated her value with the warm, personal interest of a particularly efficient accounting department. She had spent 55 years turning that knowledge into the foundation of her political method. That the method eventually ran out of room to operate in, that the specific skills she had developed over a lifetime eventually met a situation they could not manage, is perhaps the most human thing about her entire story. She died in a France that was not the France she had wanted. She died with a dynasty that was 8 months from extinction. She died surrounded by people who were already thinking about what came next, in a world that had moved past the point where what she knew and what she could do were the things most needed. She died, in other words, in the specific way that people who have spent their lives at the centre of power tend to die. Not in triumph, not in defeat, but in the particular quietness of having become, finally and completely, irrelevant to the present moment while remaining permanently relevant to the historical one. The history did not forget her. It just took a long time to decide what to do with the memory. 4.5 centuries after her death, Catherine de Medici remains one of the most recognisable names in European history. Not for her decade of genuine peacemaking efforts. Not for the grand tour that made her probably the most personally informed ruler France had in the 16th century. Not for the extraordinary administrative accomplishment of keeping a fractured, financially ruined kingdom functioning through 30 years of religious civil conflict. She's remembered primarily as the Poisoner Queen, the dark Italian schemer, the architect of the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, the witch in black who controlled her sons through fear and witchcraft, and a collection of substances that were, depending on which popular account you consult, either hidden in gloves, concealed in perfume bottles, or distributed through some other ingenious Italian delivery mechanism. The legend is vivid, internally consistent, and substantially built on foundations that the historical evidence does not particularly support. This is worth examining carefully because the gap between what Catherine actually did and what her historical reputation says she did is large enough to raise genuinely interesting questions, not just about her specifically, but about how historical reputations form, what they reflect about the people who created them, and what they continue to reflect about us when we uncritically repeat them. Start with the poisoning accusations, because they are the most specific and therefore the most testable. The black legend around Catherine, the term historians use for the accumulated body of negative mythology that formed around her, includes accusations of poisoning that range from the merely implausible to the genuinely baroque. She allegedly poisoned Jeanne d'Albret, the mother of Henry of Navarre, through a pair of perfumed gloves in 1572, an accusation that appeared almost immediately after Jeanne's death and has been repeated ever since. She allegedly poisoned various political opponents through similarly creative means. She allegedly maintained a laboratory of poisons in the Louvre, staffed by Italian specialists, producing compounds that mimicked natural illness well enough to pass medical examination. The problem with these accusations, examined one by one, is that none of them are supported by reliable contemporary evidence in the way that a historian would require before making a confident claim. Jeanne d'Albret died in Paris in June 1572, 2 months before the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, from what contemporaries described as a chest illness likely tuberculosis, or a similar respiratory condition, which was common, serious, and frequently fatal in the 16th century, without any assistance from Italian poisoners. The gloves accusation appeared in Protestant propaganda pamphlets produced after the massacre, which is exactly the context in which you would expect accusations designed to delegitimize Catherine and the French crown to proliferate, and which is not exactly the most unimpeachable source of forensic evidence. The accusation is not impossible in some abstract sense. People were occasionally poisoned in Renaissance Europe, and knowledge of toxic substances was more sophisticated than is sometimes assumed, but not impossible is a very low bar, and the specific claim has no evidentiary support beyond hostile sources produced in politically motivated circumstances. This pattern repeats for most of the specific poisoning accusations against Catherine. They come from her enemies, from Protestant polemicists, from people who had strong political and ideological reasons to portray her in the worst possible light, produced at moments of peak conflict, when the incentive to generate damaging narratives was at its highest. This does not mean every accusation against her was invented. It means that the accusations need to be evaluated against the available evidence rather than accepted because they fit a narrative that seemed coherent, and when you do that evaluation, the specific poisoning accusations largely dissolve. What Catherine actually did was considerably more than sufficient to generate genuine controversy without any mythological amplification. She was a central figure in the decisions that produced the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. She made choices throughout the wars of religion that prioritized political stability over consistent moral principles. She managed her children with an intensity that crossed the line between guidance and control in ways that had lasting consequences for their psychological development and political effectiveness. She tolerated and sometimes facilitated political violence when she calculated that it served the Crown's interests. These are real things, documented in the historical record, that a serious assessment of her career cannot avoid. They are also, notably, things that dozens of male rulers of her period did as a matter of course, without acquiring anything like the legendary dark reputation that accumulated around Catherine. This is the comparison that the Black Legend most studiously avoids: Catherine's male contemporaries. Philip II of Spain, who was her son-in-law and who ran the most powerful empire in the world during the same decades Catherine was managing France, oversaw in the Spanish Netherlands a military suppression of Protestant rebellion that killed people in numbers that dwarf any reasonable estimate of the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, and he did it as a deliberate, sustained policy, rather than as a panicked response to an immediate crisis. The Duke of Alba, who commanded this campaign, implemented what amounted to a systematic reign of terror with the full authorization and approval of his king. Philip II is remembered by historians as a complicated, deeply religious, genuinely capable ruler with serious flaws. He's not primarily remembered as a monster. He does not have a vivid popular nickname equivalent to the Poisoner Queen. Henry VIII of England executed somewhere around 70,000 people during his reign, an estimate that historians debate, but which is in any case a very large number, including 2 of his own wives, numerous former advisors, and a substantial portion of the English Catholic monastic establishment. He is remembered with a mixture of fascination and moderate disapproval, stars in innumerable television dramas, and has had more actors portray him with sympathy than probably any other Tudor figure. He is not primarily remembered as a monster either. Ivan the Terrible of Russia, who was ruling Russia during the same decades, conducted a purge of the Russian nobility called the Oprichnina that was, by any objective measure, one of the most brutal political campaigns in European history up to that point. He is remembered as terrible, which at least acknowledges the problem, but his historical reputation is considerably more nuanced in popular culture than Catherine's, and he has attracted the same kind of dramatic fascination, the complicated tyrant, the tortured genius that tends to be reserved for powerful men whose violence is read as the product of psychological complexity rather than simple evil. The pattern across these comparisons is not subtle. Male rulers who committed comparable or greater atrocities in the same period tend to be treated by history as complex figures whose violence is contextualized within a larger assessment of their political achievements and psychological depth. Catherine de Medici, a woman who held power in a world that was deeply uncomfortable with women holding power, tends to be treated as a case study in female malevolence, the Dark Queen, the poisoner, the schemer, whose gender is implicitly part of the accusation. The Italian component of her reputation compounds this. The stereotype of the sophisticated Italian poisoner, rooted in real Renaissance-era developments in chemistry, but enormously inflated by Protestant anti-Italian propaganda, attached itself to Catherine with particular tenacity because she was female, foreign, and powerful, a combination that the 16th century's cultural imagination found genuinely alarming. The machinery by which the Black Legend formed is worth tracing, because it operated through specific mechanisms rather than simply emerging from nowhere. In the immediate aftermath of August 1572, Protestant Europe needed a way to explain what had happened that did not reduce to the uncomfortable truth that France's religious wars were a complex product of structural conditions nobody had fully controlled. A single villain, a scheming Italian queen who had manipulated her weak son into authorizing the massacre, was a considerably more satisfying narrative than a catastrophic breakdown of a fragile political equilibrium involving dozens of actors over decades of escalating conflict. Villains are cleaner than systems. They offer the satisfaction of clear moral judgment without the discomfort of examining the structural conditions that make catastrophes possible. The villainization of Catherine in Protestant Europe accelerated through the pamphlet literature of the 1570s and 1580s, the period when the printing industry was producing more political propaganda than any previous era in European history, and when the incentives for producing material that confirmed what Protestant audiences already believed about Catholic France were extremely strong. Pamphlets are not known for their nuance in any era, and the 16th century version was no exception. Catherine was depicted as a witch, a poisoner, a foreign corrupter of the French kingdom, a woman whose very presence in power was an affront to the natural order, with natural order being defined, as it has been in every era, as the specific arrangements that the people currently in power found comfortable. The legend was then picked up and elaborated by later writers who found it dramatically useful. Alexandre Dumas, writing in the 19th century, produced Queen Margot his novelization of the events surrounding the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, which is a wonderfully entertaining book that treats the historical record with the creative freedom of someone who considers accuracy a suggestion rather than a requirement. Dumas' Catherine is the Black Queen of popular imagination, brilliantly malevolent and architecturally responsible for everything that went wrong. The novel was enormously popular, was adapted for the stage and eventually for film, and injected the Black Legend into 19th and 20th century popular culture with a force that serious historical scholarship has been working against ever since and working against with, it must be said, limited success, because Dumas is more entertaining than most historical monographs, and the human appetite for a vivid villain is not easily satisfied by documentary evidence. What made the legend stick beyond its dramatic appeal was the specific cultural template it fit. The powerful woman who achieves her goals through poison, manipulation, and dark knowledge rather than through the legitimate use of force is an archetype that appears across cultures and periods from Medea to Lucrezia Borgia to eventually Catherine herself. The archetype is almost always applied to women and almost never to men, which tells you something about the function it serves. When men use political violence or manipulation, it tends to be described in the language of statecraft hard choices, political necessity, the requirements of power. When women do the same things, the language shifts: scheming, manipulation, poison, witchcraft. The actions may be identical. The vocabulary of judgment is not. Catherine was not an innocent. She made decisions that caused suffering. She wielded power in ways that were sometimes ruthless and sometimes disastrously miscalculated. The real case against her, the one built from documented decisions rather than invented crimes, is serious enough to engage with honestly without any fictional embellishment. But the real case against her looks very different from the legendary one, and the difference is revealing. The real case says, here was a capable woman who made terrible decisions under extreme pressure in circumstances that were not of her making, and those decisions had consequences she could neither predict nor control. The legendary case says, here was a uniquely evil woman whose wickedness was expressed through specifically feminine means: poison, seduction, manipulation, and who bears personal, intentional responsibility for everything bad that happened in France during her lifetime. The first version requires you to think about structural conditions, political incentives, the limits of individual agency and historical processes, and the genuine complexity of governing a country through religious civil war. The second version requires only that you find the villain convincing. It is not difficult to understand why the second version has had more popular durability. The feminist dimension of this analysis does not require you to be partisan about Catherine, or to minimize what she actually did. It requires only that you apply a consistent standard of judgment that you ask. For each of the things Catherine is accused of, whether a male ruler in comparable circumstances would be judged by the same standard, described in the same language, and remembered with the same specific flavour of condemnation. When you do this consistently, the answer is clearly no, and the gap is large enough to constitute a historical problem rather than simply a matter of individual interpretation. There is a version of Catherine's story that has been told less often than it deserves. The version in which a woman of extraordinary capability, operating in a world that had no legitimate place for her ambitions, spent 55 years finding ways to be effective despite every structural obstacle, made some genuinely terrible decisions along the way for reasons that were understandable even when they were not defensible, and was then assigned by history a reputation that reflected the period's discomfort with her gender as much as it reflected her actual record. This version does not require you to like Catherine or to excuse her worst decisions. It requires only that you hold the actual evidence up against the legend and note, with appropriate dryness, how much of the legend consists of things that can't be documented, applied through a framework that doesn't get used for men, by people who had very strong reasons to portray her in the worst possible light. The story of Catherine de Medici is, in the end, two stories running simultaneously. One is the story of an actual woman who lived an extraordinary life in extraordinary circumstances, and whose legacy is genuinely mixed in ways that deserve serious engagement. The other is the story of what happens when a woman holds power in a world that finds female power inherently suspicious. The story of how quickly real complexity gets flattened into the figure of the Dark Queen, the poisoner, the schemer, and how long that flattened figure persists even after the evidence against it has been examined and found wanting. Both stories are true, both are important. The second one, in particular, is not only a story about the 16th century. It is a story about every period in which powerful women have had their records selectively read, their motives assumed to be sinister, where a man's would be assumed to be strategic, and their failures treated as evidence of fundamental female untrustworthiness, while their achievements are either minimized or credited to the men around them. Catherine's specific case is 4.5 centuries old. The pattern it exemplifies is considerably more recent. History, as a discipline, has been working to untangle the Catherine de Medici of the record from the Catherine de Medici of the legend for several generations now, and the serious historical literature on her is considerably more nuanced than the popular one. Leonie Frieda's biography, Janine Garrison's work, the various scholarly reassessments of the 20th and 21st centuries, these have produced a Catherine who is recognisably human, rather than symbolically monstrous, whose decisions make sense within their context even when they are not defensible, and whose contribution to French history was real and substantial, even as it was deeply flawed. This is the Catherine who deserves to be the primary one in popular memory. Whether she will eventually displace the Poisoner Queen in the broader cultural imagination is, honestly, uncertain. Dramatic legends have a durability that documented complexity tends to struggle to match. What can be said with confidence, looking back across the full arc of her story, is this. Catherine de Medici was a woman who arrived with nothing, survived everything, built more than history generally credits her with, destroyed more than she intended to, and was remembered in ways that told the world more about its discomfort with female power than about who she actually was. She was not a saint. She was not a uniquely diabolical figure. She was a politician, talented, flawed, operating under impossible conditions, who happened to be a woman in a world that did not have a coherent framework for what that meant. The framework the world eventually settled on for her was the Poisoner Queen. It was, like most such frameworks, more comfortable than accurate. The mirror that Catherine's story holds up is not a flattering one. It shows us a world that punished women for the same ambitions it rewarded in men, that explained female power through the language of witchcraft and poison, because it could not accommodate the possibility that competence and ruthlessness were not, in fact, gendered qualities. It shows us a historical process in which propaganda produced by political opponents became accepted as biography. And it shows us, if we look carefully, something about our own moment, about the specific ways in which powerful women continue to be described, judged, and remembered differently from powerful men, and about the distance still remaining between the standards we claim to apply and the ones we actually do. Catherine de Medici died in January 1589, ignored by a court that had moved on. History spent 4 centuries arguing about what she was. The argument is still worth having, not because it will produce a clean verdict, but because the questions it raises about power, gender, and the mechanics of reputation are questions that did not die with the 16th century. They travelled forward through time with the same persistence that the Black Legend itself displayed, and they are, if anything, more relevant now than they were when a 14-year-old girl from Florence arrived at the French court and found herself assessed, found insufficient, and proceeded to spend the next 55 years proving the assessment wrong. She was not what they said she was. She was not entirely what her defenders have claimed either. She was something considerably more interesting than either. A specific, complicated, remarkable human being who lived in a specific, complicated, remarkable moment in history, and who deserves to be remembered on those terms with all the difficulty that actually entails, and without the comfortable simplifications that have served everyone's purposes except the truth's. Sleep well, and the next time someone tells you the story of the Poisoner Queen, ask them which sources they're using. Catherine would have.